Ooh, it's loud. Hey, Margaret, what's up?
Hey, how's it going?
There's a huge difference between the icon that appears representing you
Yeah.
and your actual appearance now. I think the change in my appearance is relatively subtle, even over the last 10 years. But some people don't feel that way about me. I got the one of the first girls I dated, but the girl I lost my virginity with, she discovered me on YouTube. So obviously she hadn't talked to me for decades. And when she knew me, I not only had a head of hair, but I also had a beard. And she really said, when she first watched my videos, she thought, is that the same guy? Is that the same guy? And the only time she knew that she could confirm it was me when she heard me laughing. She said, you still laugh the way you did when you were 16 years old. But everything else had changed beyond recognition. So, you know.
You do have to tell me about the scarves. I was going to ask you.
Do it. Well, it's not a real super private question, but it comes up in a lot of different contexts. This scarf is a Cambodian scarf. When I lived in Laos, you know, I've never like pretended to have more in common with the cultures I study than I do. Like, you know, give an example, Korean Ojibwe culture. I'm not going to pretend to you like, oh, I'm so into hunting buffalo. Or, you know, I mean, there are all kinds of, I was, to give an example, when I was studying Korean Ojibwe culture, I was invited to go to sweat lodges, you know, that kind of spiritual ceremony, and I had to say, look, guys, I wouldn't do it for the Catholics either. You know what I mean? Like, I remember I said once, it was a couple different situations, but once I said, if I was there, it wouldn't be a real ceremony. You know, it'd be a fake, because, you know, because I'm not there for those reasons, right? But, you know, it's flattering to get invited. But one of the things I could participate in Cambodian culture and Laotian culture was the scarf thing. And it is different in those two cultures. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is, you know, I remember running into myself in a mirror in a mall about the year 2000. And I had to recognize I'm a scary guy. You know, as soon as you turn a corner in a mall and there's a full-length...
The scarf helps with that.
Yes! No, it does. Like, you turn the corner in a mall, and there's a full-length mirror that you weren't expecting to be there, and you're all of a sudden, you're running into yourself. You go, shit, this guy's going to kick my ass. You know, so I think maybe you don't have this exact problem. But I've always looked for ways to kind of make my look a bit more feminine. Without being effeminate. That's a good way to put it. And I'm not going to do jewelry. I'm not going to wear necklaces and so on. But I do think genuinely with a lot of my outfits, putting on a scarf, it softens the look a bit. Because, you know, without wanting to look menacing, a lot of people do respond to me as menacing. And yeah, when you're in Southeast Asia where you're double the body mass of most of the people around you, that might be more of an issue. Or China, for that matter. But honestly, no. It's more of an issue in Canada. People here are real fraidy cats. People here are real easy to get scared. The average Cambodian probably looks at me and thinks, the five of us can kick his ass. Doesn't matter if he's a bit. There's five of us and there's only one of him. They're not that intimidating.
I guess it's because I'm fairly tall, but all my cousins are
right.
You know, 6'5" and above.
That's right.
You
mentioned that.
You know, the tallest is around 6'10", and I can't say I've never found him intimidating particularly,
right.
But maybe it's because I'm tall.
Right, but you know, I mean, like I was saying with Southeast Asia too, it's not just height, it's intensity. Anyway, I make a certain kind of impression on people, and you've talked about that too, though. You've talked about, well, okay, in gender terms, you talked about not wanting to be perceived as bitchy. And I've seen you talk about that. I've seen you talk about it on YouTube. We talked about it in some kind of email back and forth at some point. Mm-hmm. You know, the issue of what is the culture of being nice, or what is the culture of being perceived as a bitch if you're a woman, or maybe an asshole as a man, or being demanding, or being intimidating, and those things. So I know I'm from a somewhat different, you know, from a gendered perspective, where probably fist fights are not the main issue. I think that's stuff you handle too. But yeah, you know, and actually this does relate to one of the topics we're going to talk about in a sense, because it's true. I mean, I'm someone who's a demanding person. I'm someone who's very open about, you know, like right now I'm dealing with the university, and I'm open about the demands I'm expecting the university to live up to, and so on. It's like, look, can you do this for me or not, and so on. And it's tough. I mean, it's whether you're a man or woman to come across that way and negotiate those things, and you don't want to seem bitchy, and you don't want to seem like a pushover, and you want to balance those things. And I think about it all the time. You have kids. I have kid singular, and exactly these kinds of issues. I mean, I would not describe myself as a perfectionist. I think I'm a very sloppy, impressionistic sort of person. But, you know, I do have all kinds of moral standards I expect the people in my life to live up to. But to give a really simple example. So when I first got together with my first wife, who's now my ex-wife, she smoked cigarettes. I'd say once in a while. She wasn't a heavy smoker or something. And as soon as she got with me, she didn't even discuss with me. She just knew, like, this was not going to be part of her life anymore. Speak around me. Some people would say that makes me a jerk, but part of it is, and she didn't drink heavily or anything, but before she got with me, my first wife, she did drink alcohol, to some extent on occasions. So and, I don't remember us even debating it or whatever. She really saw who I was and how I lived, and she wanted to be part of my life and so on. And she knew that, like, either alcohol was going to disappear completely from her life or was going to be something she drank once a year or something. So, those things now, that's people who love each other and want to spend time together. The thing is about modern Western society is that it's composed of millions of people who don't love each other and don't want to spend time together. But we don't have a choice. We're all struggling to survive on the mean streets of Calgary, Alberta. No?
Yes. No, so how's everything going with the you made a video this morning, actually.
Yeah.
That I did enjoy very much.
Oh,
the one that you made about intersectional people and the vegan tradition and everything like that. I was watching it and thinking it did reflect a lot of the areas that we do have more in common.
Right.
And one of the reasons that I really respect your channel and enjoy your channel, the other video that you made about Tara McCarthy, also, those are things that we really share. So I think that this is an interesting discussion, not just because we're going to disagree about things, but also because we agree about, I think, more than, I can't say that for certain, but we agree about some very important things. We probably disagree about some very important things as well. And I really enjoyed that video because you were talking about how a lot of people find veganism privileged. There was actually a report out from Greenpeace today. You probably saw it. Greenpeace is now saying we do actually need to address animal agriculture, but that's kind of a first for them. And their argument all along has been that veganism is too hard for people, that it is not a value that can easily be shared by people who are struggling in the developing world and things like that. And
their founders were East Coast fishermen types. Those guys.
Yeah,
they worked, so and
they also they do try to pretend that they are very appealing to the masses. I think that may be questionable, but I did think that was interesting that they made that argument for so long. They're moving away from it now, I think, because they have to. But it is a very common argument. And one that I don't tend to find terribly convincing, and I don't think you do either.
Well, so that's interesting. You were saying it's because they were wanting to maybe get down with that proletarian mass culture.
Yeah.
But the founders, they were pretty proletarian guys. They were uneducated blue-collar guys who had worked on fishing boats on the East Coast. So I think they weren't faking being proletarian. I think those guys were proletarian. I met and spoke to one of them, one of the founders of Greenpeace. Memorable conversation at the foot of the CN Tower while members of Greenpeace were climbing the side of the CN Tower and hanging a poster on it. But that was actually after the founder, was exiled from Greenpeace, which is a typical, left-wing thing. There was a struggle to take over the leadership, the usual story. But look, you've said in the past too, that you deal much more with the sort of stereotypical social justice warrior category of person, with virtue signaling and these things. I was searching my own channel. I don't think the term SJW has ever been in the title or description of one of my videos before. Just to give an example, it hasn't been as much of what I've had to deal with as what you've had to deal with online. I think. No?
Yeah, I think part of that's too because I allow comments on my channel and you don't, so you might be hearing more from those people if you got people who weren't, supporters talking to you. You might hear more from them.
But I do. Just I have open email all the time. People talk to me. I do open live streams. Live chatting, and take up with several videos just uploaded now from that. And then also I did over a year with comments on the channel. While I was in Kunming, because at that time I didn't have a job and I did have time to run it. So there's been a lot of opportunity, but I think there were other factors there for why. Maybe they approach someone like you either because they expect you to sympathize with them, or because they think they can win, because they think they can push you around.
I get both. I get people telling me that I'm a social justice warrior. I've had that accusation, from people like Charles. And then I have other people who think that I am not nearly enough of that sort of person. I think social justice is important. You think social justice is important too. I think we both consider that very significant, right? Like,
Look,
that's
it's one of those things. I don't know if I've said it exactly this way in a video, but when people talk about effective activism, the actual phrase effective activism, well, of course, would you want ineffective activism? I mean, it seems like something nobody can object to. But then when you find out what it really means, what's behind the mask of this term, I mean, likewise, who doesn't want social justice? I mean, it sounds so
in the same way, I would never consider myself intersectional because the term is inappropriately applied to white people anyway. But I think that it's, obviously we all want to look for ways that we can work together, and I think that's really all that intersection is. Like, we have intersections of our own values, so that's the kind of thing that I think is helpful. I think a lot of it is not helpful, though. And it's interesting. I think when it comes to the political spectrum, if I was going to make a statement about the differences between us, I would say that we both probably fall fairly similarly lined up on the left if we're looking at a left-right, authoritarian, libertarian perspective. I think that we are probably around the middle somewhere, maybe slightly to the left, and I would say that you definitely lean more towards authoritarianism in terms of values and things than I do lean more, I guess, towards libertarianism. Although I think we would both fit in with a democratic context. I think we both support liberal democracy. I definitely am.
So can I ask you? I've never heard you associate with the word libertarian before, and it means different things to different people. So I'm just going to ask you an open-ended question. Can you give me an example, not drug policy, any other example of a libertarian policy, that you support or that for you evokes why libertarianism is important to you, or something?
I wouldn't say I don't like to put labels on myself. I'm just going to be saying that in terms of just that broad spectrum. But the thing that would probably land me more there, not just the drug policy. Everything related to personal liberty and things, I think it's quite important to me. I'm a big proponent of that. And also, when it comes to economics and things like that, I think I'm actually a little bit more on the liberal in terms of libertarian, so we don't get confused with left and right. But I think I'm a little bit more that way as well. So.
To give an example, I assume you do not object to the fact that currently there are taxes on cigarettes that intentionally discourage people from smoking cigarettes. A pure libertarian, I think, would object to that. Yeah.
I definitely know that you are a very big fan of taxes to discourage certain things. It's okay. I mean, I'm not. I don't think that they should be as punishing as they are. I think there's other ways to discourage people from smoking cigarettes. So no, I'm not a huge fan of punitive taxes on most things, including cigarettes, drugs, alcohol, all that stuff.
I mean, as vegans, we rely on government regulations. To give you an example, in Germany, they have very good government regulations just for labeling food, so I can see right away whether it's vegan or not. But this is government meddling in the free market, so to speak. And I love it. I prefer the German system. In Taiwan, also, the government really strictly defines what is and isn't vegan. And if food is labeled as vegan, then in the factory has to meet up to certain conditions so that the food is truly vegan. These are just examples of government regulation that directly pertain to veganism. Where, broadly speaking, anything can be done badly, but broadly speaking, I'm optimistic about all that stuff. Like, great, we got labeling regulations, this kind of thing.
And I'm not terribly against those things. I think that it's fine. I support democracy in that if a nation votes and decides that they want to put labels on things, then they have the right to have the government do that sort of thing. I've talked to my channel before. One thing that I disagree with a lot of with libertarians about is the raw milk thing. I've talked about that. I do think, though, that if adults want to drink it and kill themselves, whatever. That's totally their choice. I do think, and a lot of people who identify more with that libertarian perspective would also agree that when it comes to children and when it comes to the kind of impact that you're having on other people, like the whole, the idea that, my right to swing my fist ends at the tip of your nose, right? Yeah. So I do think there has to be some holding back on your personal rights. It can't just be a free-for-all.
For example, speed limits. I assume you generally favor speed limits, or would you prefer if... it's a real interesting hypothetical. How different would our society be if there were no speed limits?
I definitely would prefer a society with no speed limits.
Oh, really? Okay. So that's the difference between you and I. Okay, that's interesting.
That's because I favor driverless cars, which again.
Okay, that's a cop out. Okay.
No, but it's also a contradiction. That is interfering with your right to conduct your vehicle however you please. But again,
between the years 1965 and 1985, when there were no robots, Would you prefer speed limits or no speed limits?
I would prefer speed limits. I think that if the people want to vote to have speed limits, then we can all decide together that that's a good idea. So I'm not against that.
Well, I'd say that issue of voting comes up rarely on my channel because, sadly, it comes up very rarely in real life. So I'll mention this briefly. I will have a book review coming up. It's a book written by one of my professors that I know face-to-face here. And the book's thesis, which is depressing but possibly true, is that we're living in an era when democracy matters less and less. Now, I don't want to believe that. The professor also doesn't want to believe that. But he's talking about the mechanisms for why he sees that to be the case. But, it's funny to just hear you say repeatedly, well, if people vote on this, that they want it. When was the last time people voted on anything? Now, if you live in some parts of the United States, it's always an irony. In some parts of the United States, you do have a local referendum on, do you want to build a bridge? Do you want to raise the fares on the local speed train? Like, sometimes they do have specific referendums for local things. In Canada, we really don't. In Canada, we only have a referendum when it's about abortion or whether or not Quebec should be a separate country, and that's about it. We don't have a lot of referendums in Canada. But, when was the last time direct democracy mattered in any society I've been following? I just say it is very rarely within my lifetime. I wish I could say that too, but I don't feel democracy gives us an easy answer on these things. Yeah, go on.
I think it would. This is totally left field and out of the topic area we were planning on discussing, but I still think this is really important. I've been talking to people a lot lately about the Second Amendment in the U.S., and I feel that a lot of people vastly misinterpret the Second Amendment, your right to bear arms. To me, defending yourself in the 21st century has so much more to do with your liberty online, your ability to be yourself, your ability to have a VPN, to be able to engage in direct democracy that way, to be able to directly be able to defend yourself and defend your freedom of speech and everything else like that. I think that's way more important. That's something I can get behind a lot more than, assault rifles for everyone. I think it's much more important to be able to have that ability to express yourself and to protect yourself also from unwanted invasion of privacy and things like that. I think that's a bigger issue, and I would like to see more people get behind that because, like you say, we may not be directly voting and things like that in this day and age, but we could all have more of a role in everything we do if we took our online privacy and our online ability to defend ourselves a lot more seriously. So that's just a strange thought I've been having lately. But
one issue, I'll bring it up here under the heading of, we've kind of just been talking about things we have in common and ways in which we're different. I have a list of videos I'm supposed to make, and I've had this on the list since the last time we spoke, which was on Google Hangouts, not Skype, but not that long ago, a couple months ago, and I've had a very eventful, busy month since then. And, this is one of the differences between us. You have a kind of technological optimism, I would say, an optimism about technology. I'll specify more what I mean in just a second, that I lack. And I just say partly, now my lack of technological optimism, you could say is linked actually to my having kind of philosophical optimism. I do feel optimistic that the same fundamental issues I'm looking at when I read Socrates still matter today, when I'm reading ancient Buddhist philosophy still matter today, and when I'm in a very primitive and technologically backward part of northern Laos in small remote villages. Believe me, those villages now, one by one, are coming onto the internet. In just 10 years, the internet literally penetrates the jungle. But be that as it may, I don't actually see a stark difference. Most of these issues we talk about, obviously, dating has changed tremendously. That is a real example. I met my girlfriend because of the internet. There are things that have been transformed by the internet. But I'm in that sense technologically pessimistic and philosophically optimistic. I see a lot of continuity and a lot of these issues as being fundamentally rooted in ancient and unchanging challenges for human nature. So the last time we talked, and I've had it on my list that I was supposed to make a video about this, and I never had time. You are very optimistic that, basically, for example, the development of soy milk. I think that's one of your strongest examples. Look, already today, soy milk and other sources of protein like soy milk are better than and cheaper than cow's milk. Of course, they have way better ecological impacts. You can measure their efficiency in many different ways, but efficiency includes what are called economic externalities, like water pollution. It doesn't just include the price to the consumer, but measured in every way, including price to consumer, soy milk really is better than cow milk. And that in this way, likewise, we should see a cascading effect throughout the free market I think you would say without government intervention or with very little government intervention, of a kind of pseudo-veganism or reluctant reducitarianism sweeping the nation as those technological replacements happen. And I countered that by just using some examples. I said, look, I think it's true there are some examples that favor your analysis or your leaning, but I see examples to the contrary also, just like the enormous profit to be had by simply taking a lobster cage, throwing it in the ocean and getting a lobster. And I think it's fair to say, I mean, yes, you can make a robot lobster, but there's a very real sense in which, there is no soy milk equivalent for a lobster, and perhaps there never will be. I think maybe that's fair to say, maybe not. And also, just in terms of the profitability, that action, throwing it in a lobster cage and then reeling it back in a few hours later with a lobster in it, it has none of those complexities of running a factory farm. You don't buy food for the lobster. You don't provide it with shelter. You don't. The person doing the fishing won't feel they're polluting the water. They may in reality be. So I just point out there are some examples that challenge that, and for me again plug me into a more kind of ancient continuum of these problems and not so much a technologically optimistic way of looking forward.
And even with that, I guess I would say also, no matter how cheap a supply is, you need to have the demand. And if you have foods that people prefer, if it starts becoming true that people prefer one thing over another, they say, I prefer New Wave Foods lobster over traditional lobster. It tastes less fishy or whatever. Like, who knows? If people can produce something better, then I think that's a problem that will be solved by the market. I would say that there's certainly a high potential there. And there's also, as we move gradually, and I guess I am very optimistic about the future of humanity, of society, and I do see us moving away from violence and towards a better world. And I think that the social pressure to stop adopting those behaviors is going to increase. We see already, videos from PETA online, for example, where they show, live lobsters being, well, not lobsters, usually it's like octopus and things like that, being eaten by people, in the Far East somewhere. And they'll say, oh, isn't this disgusting? This is so, and whether or not that's hypocritical, which we might not agree that it's totally fair to pick on people in Asia for eating living animals. It's something that raises a lot of disgust in the Western world. That may be, as I said, it may be very hypocritical, but it is a sign of a changing view of things. We tend to view punishments that were considered de rigueur in the 18th century to be completely abominable today. And I think that that's changing about our views towards animals. So I don't think it's just going to be the economic factors. I think there's also the demand. I mean, it is economic, but there's also the demand issue. So that's my response to that in terms of why I'm still optimistic in spite of examples like that.
So this is actually an interesting bridge to several topics I think we want to discuss today. I'm interested to hear you say that because I think what you were speaking positively of there, partly you can gloss it as cultural change, but partly it is also shame. That people should people should feel ashamed to wear fur, for example, which again has come about in some cultures, not others, and in some cultures it's come and gone. Some cultures hit a peak around 1988 where everyone was ashamed to wear fur, and then fur made a comeback in the 90s. I mean, it comes and goes. But I think one of the differences between myself and the younger generation, people say 20 years younger than me, am I that old? Yeah. Is that I do, in that sense, regard shame positively. There's an old phrase in Latin, shame is the mother of wisdom. I don't know if anyone coined it, or if that's, probably the Catholic Church coined it, or what have you,
Sounds like it.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just one of those homilies that has no particular author. But, I don't, I'm actually quite comfortable with shame being a part of the vegan movement. And, shame being, you've heard me say this on the channel in different contexts, one of the reasons why people don't smoke cigarettes is because they don't want to be the kind of person who smokes cigarettes. The perception of if some guy comes over and he's dating my daughter, and my first impression of him is I see him smoking cigarettes in front of my door before he comes in. Smokers often have to do that before they go indoors. That, there is stigma and there is shame. And I'm willing to regard that in that sense, analytically, positively as part of that cultural shame.
I would just add to that, as much as shame, it can be a positive thing. I mean, there's always positive ways in which peer pressure can influence us. But also, if someone doesn't feel that shame, I don't think, unless they are harming someone else, and, if we decide as a society that it is harming someone else to hurt a lobster, that's that. But if you don't feel shame and everyone else does feel shame, I don't think that I don't think that that's a reason for you to cease your activity. You have that ability as a private person. And I think that's where we would really differ. It's not that I deny that shame exists or that it can even be useful. There's some utility to shame. I'm not going to deny that. There can be utility to it. However, just because you don't feel shame doesn't mean you must comply with the prevailing society. You don't need to do what everyone else is doing just because you don't feel ashamed by something that ashames everybody else.
So I'm not really sure what you think the difference is there, because you said that's something where we differ. I mean,
so I'm going to tie that into the idea of drug use, because that's the issue that we've been kind of disagreeing with each other about, and I wouldn't even say really disagreeing. I think it's more just that we just have different viewpoints on it. But when it comes to drug use, I know that you tend to see drug use as a social evil. You do believe people should feel ashamed of drug use. You do feel that drug use should be banned, which is a little bit different and goes an extra step beyond, just having people be ashamed of, cigarette smoking or something like that. You think that it should be enforced by the prevailing society, that social norm should be enforced through legislation, and I do not.
Okay, so where do you think the difference lies in terms of our attitudes towards shame? Because I think what you actually said was that if someone doesn't feel ashamed, then in effect the consequences of the shame are not incumbent upon them. Somewhere, I just wasn't sure what the difference
more or less. I mean, if you happen to be, any action that doesn't hurt other people, or doesn't hurt them enough to justify banning it legally, you shouldn't have to just go along to get along. I think you can...
Okay, well, I'll challenge you this, because, look, there's a difference between descriptive statements and prescriptive statements. What I'm talking about here with shame is really descriptive. It's the way the world actually is, not the way the world ought to be. But right now, cigarettes are legal in Canada, and I don't know if there is a country where nicotine is illegal, but maybe there is one. But, if you are a medical doctor and you still smoke cigarettes, you're literally going out into the waiting room or something where your patients see you.
That would be breaking the law. So that's, it depends on where you live.
Well, okay,
sorry. It would be breaking
normally,
the law.
here, look, I'm just going to be honest with you. Here, I see doctors smoking cigarettes a few steps in front of their offices where the patients see them. Okay, I'm just saying, regardless of where you're actually smoking, my point was you're stepping outside of your office to smoke and stepping back in, whether that's in a smoking lounge or a lobby or outdoors. Anyway, so regardless, in different places, sometimes you can designate a smoking lounge, sometimes you can't. My point is, yes, I do think a doctor should feel ashamed of that. Now, should a doctor feel more or less ashamed than another person?
Again, his job. I think that's the more, if we're moving from descriptive to prescriptive. I certainly don't think he should lose his job just because he smokes.
Right. But we're not really talking about him losing his job. I think we're talking about the culture of shame and pressure being on people. So, in that sense, I do think the effects of shame or whatever, they do impact people. They are incumbent upon people. They do put an onus on people who don't subscribe to them. You may have a medical doctor, I've met some people like this, who says, oh, well, I read Friedrich Nietzsche and I don't believe in any of your social values, so I can still smoke cigarettes, or even I can smoke pot, or even can use cocaine and still be a medical doctor, and all you people can hang for all I care. That may be his personal attitude, but nevertheless, I think there will be a very real culture of shame and obloquy that cultivates around
it. And that's fine.
And again, we're not talking about a situation where someone could be simply fired. Most medical doctors, who's going to fire you? But this guy's going to have a reputation. There's going to be odium. There's going to be judgment. And there are going to be consequences.
But also, if he doesn't care, he should be able to continue. I'm just still defending this doctor. He still has the right to continue doing what he's doing as long as he's not harming his patients or it's not affecting the quality of his work.
Oh, okay. Well, all right, so let's talk a little bit about harm. Your philosophy, as you stated. Sorry, I just want to say as a note, we have talked about this by email before coming on. Most of my discussions with people I do know prep by email. We just say, okay, let's meet at this time, talk about it. I have no idea where they stand. But I would point out to you, during our email conversation, I really found out what your position on drug legalization was. I didn't know that at the beginning, so it was it was genuine learning on my part, and I think that's true on your part, at least partly. I think at least you responded to me with assumptions about both what I believed and why I believed it that are really not true, and that's it's understandable.
I look forward to finding that
out. Okay, so maybe you haven't found that out yet.
Yeah.
But I thought and from my perspective, I genuinely didn't know what your position was, and from my perspective, you were saying a lot of contradictory things. Some of them may still be contradictory. But look, so I've mentioned this example on the channel before. In some countries, it is legal to drink alcohol openly in a public park. And in some, it's a crime, and it's a very commonly enforced crime that, no, you don't have the ability to drink. You don't have the civil right to drink alcohol in a park. But if we believe that people do have that civil right, if we're living in one of the countries in Europe, most of the ones I know of, where people are allowed to get drunk sitting on a park bench or having a picnic or what have you, then everyone has the right. Then, your medical doctor can go and get drunk in the park, and, a factory worker can do it, and your own son or daughter can do it. And you have to recognize, okay, this is their civil right. So I do start from the fundamental perspective that this, if we're really talking about questions of rights and consequences, this has to be equal for all humanity, unless there's some really strange reason. Those are getting into desert island scenarios or what have you.
Or operating heavy machinery and things like that. Obviously, people who do dangerous jobs, and there's reasons why their employers may not allow them to maintain that employment while consuming those substances.
Well, you see, I guess I'm really reluctant to even separate humanity into two classes that way. You've said, for example, in email that you think it's quite possible for someone to be a highly effective person, to hold down their job and pay their rent and live a good life while using cocaine more than once a week, should we say?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay, so is that possible for a police officer to do?
That's up for their employer. That would be in the case of the state to decide if that's something that they can do. I think that's obviously it's a decision that has to be made by employer. Whoever is paying.
I don't believe there are two classes of humanity, one to whom those standards apply and one it doesn't apply. If I believe that's incumbent on a police officer for his role, then I think that's a moral rule for myself and for my daughter and for my brothers and everyone else. So and conversely,
can't be, for example, they can't be overweight, or they used to not even be under a certain height. Is that something that you're going to make a law against for the rest of humanity?
Well,
I think that those rules exist for a reason, and they are placed there by employers. Employers have the right to make those decisions, in my opinion.
All right, but with a police officer, this isn't really a regular employer. I think it is. Yeah. Right. This is a role in terms of the type of alertness. These are really mental qualities we're talking about. Some people can't be a police officer because they're disabled. They're in a wheelchair. Yes. Right. Some people are disqualified for
argument because obviously there are two different classes. There are many different classes of people for all jobs. So we can't say that our rules for society have to be equal among all occupations and all walks of life.
Okay.
So.
I think the ethical rules for our society do have to be the same for everyone in society. That really is my point here. I don't look at the world in terms of, you people, it's okay for you people to get stoned and waste your time and waste your brain cells and give yourself brain damage. It doesn't matter. That's fine for you. But for someone like an airline pilot or a police officer or a medical doctor, for those quality people, then these higher expectations apply. I really don't regard society that way.
Can you state exactly what your prescriptions are then? Because if you don't, so you think that certain qualifications are okay, asking them to, have certain degrees, etc. Like what exactly? So you're saying there's the moral difference. It's morality for you that is the distinguishing factor between. That should never be a distinguishing factor for people. So the moral qualifications for being a street sweeper should be the same as a lawyer or someone who's in charge of children.
I'm saying that when we're talking within the province of ethical judgments, that they apply to all of the society we're talking about equally.
But ethical judgments are obviously going to differ person to person. There are certain things that we might decide on as a society, but then there are individual moral judgments.
Well, I think exactly what we're talking about in politics is very much the opposite of that. So, for example, if the ethical judgment we're talking about is it's irresponsible to use cocaine multiple times per week and then to make important decisions while under the influence of cocaine, such as being a police officer in your duties. And again, we're not talking about being high while on the job here. We're talking about a theoretical police officer, I guess, who in his downtime. is using cocaine. But you and I both know, and we're assuming the audience has some knowledge also. We're implicitly assuming here that using cocaine multiple times per week has quite a few different knock-on effects in your life and brings with it certain dangers, including the danger of it escalating to being multiple times a day, being an outright addiction. So, that danger being there, we recognize, I think, is irresponsible for a police officer.
I'm
yes.
I'm afraid we don't agree on that. But,
okay. So you do think it's okay for a police officer to use cocaine multiple times per week?
I'm not going to make any completely definitive statement, but I'm going to say that it would be very difficult for me to make that judgment without. Because I do know people who are able to do very serious jobs that require a lot of, all those sorts of things. No, I couldn't say that. Yeah. No,
so look again, the much less inflammatory example of getting drunk in the park. It may be uncomfortable for me to see my own school teacher or my own school principal getting drunk in the park. Yeah. But genuinely, the last time I was in London, that was still on the books. There, you could, and it's possible you're walking through the park and there's your school principal, your teacher getting drunk. It is possible a police officer, when he's off duty, is putting out a picnic blanket or sitting on a park bench and drinking whiskey. If that's a civil right, if that's ethically acceptable, then it's acceptable for everyone.
Wait a second. Again, ethically acceptable. So you're equating the law with ethics. So is that just kind of your starting point? I kind of assume it is because you do have this slightly more. And I hate saying authoritarian.
Right.
I think I need to think of a nicer way to say it because I don't mean that you're an authoritarian. I'm not equating you with Kim Jong-il or anything. But but you do have this way of conflating law and morality. So that's something that.
Right. Well, I think
comfortable with.
Well, of course, in Cambodia under the Pol Pot regime, where they were killing people in accordance with the law, or under Lenin's dictatorship after the revolution, there are situations in which the law is totally immoral. However, for the purposes of this conversation, I think what we're talking about is exactly the overlap of, if you like, legislation and morality or public policy and morality. I would just say, I think this conversation would be banal if I were to separate them and say, well, the court system being completely corrupt, there's no point in discussing that. Let's only discuss the ethical rules we follow in our own lives voluntarily. I mean, but in large part, I am discussing the latter. I am discussing whether or not. I mean, look, Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. I mean,
I was going to bring up more like Plato with the Philosopher King because, I think this is highly hypothetical, but I also question whether it's even desirable. I'm not sure I would want to live in a society that was trying to legislate morality in.
But it does. But it does right now. I mean, this is descriptive and not
that
right.
May be, but it doesn't make it the right way to run a society.
Okay, but my point is, again, with some societies, it is allowed for you to be in a park drinking alcohol, and for some it's not. But if it is allowed, it's allowed for everyone. I can't accept that I live in a society that has two classes of human beings, and we say some people are the sort of people who drink from alcohol in the park, and some are not, and we're going to legislate that. So you see why. I mean, I am talking about exactly the overlap of ethics and legislation. Now, why is it, why would you accept that some people can, because you have stated in an email, you support cocaine being entirely legal, and currently in Colombia, cocaine for personal use up to a certain number of grams is legal. So it's not a crime in Colombia to have cocaine for personal use. And this comes back to the culture of shame and acceptance that creates a culture in which it is accepted for people to use cocaine.
I don't think that that's necessarily true. Just because something is accepted for personal use, it doesn't mean that people aren't going to try and create programs to help people. It doesn't mean that people don't think that it's wrong. They may think that it's wrong, but they don't feel that it's worth the greater wrong of using the violence of the state in order to prevent people from being able to live their lives as they see fit.
Right, but
that's where it's like, is it worth the violence?
Here in Canada right now, we use the violence of the state to prevent people from drinking alcohol in public parks. It's not terribly violent. We use the violence of the state to prevent people speeding in their cars on highways. I mean, this is the description of society as it actually exists. And we use the violence of the states to discourage people from using cocaine. So I take it in a society like Colombia, where cocaine use is legal, you still would not want police officers using cocaine, although it's actually their civil right, although they can do so.
Would I? Or are you talking about personally?
Yeah.
I don't think that that's any of the. I think that it depends. Are they currently working, things like that? Just as you had with whether if someone is drinking alcohol, how long has it been, that kind of thing. I think that it should have more to do with their personal choice when they're not working, but that's
okay. So you're fine with police officers using cocaine multiple times per week?
I think that's something that people of Colombia need to decide, but I think that
we're talking about Canada. Okay, let's talk about Canada. You think Canada should have the same laws Colombia has? So in Canada, on this specific issue, you think that Canada, like Colombia, should make it legal for people to use cocaine? So if it's legal for people, if it's a civil right, then it's legal for police officers to use cocaine multiple times per week.
This is a question that has popped up a lot with oil industry around here, at least, and with the impending legalization of marijuana in Canada. There is a lot of question about people who work in the oil industry. Should they be allowed to use marijuana on their personal time? And I think overwhelmingly people think that that's probably a good idea to allow them to have the same use as everyone else, just kind of like we were talking about. But then there are questions like, when they're on the job, how do we determine whether they have been consuming too close to the time that they are working and things like that? I think those are important questions if we're just trying to find out those things. As with any other drug that inhibits your ability to work. For example, for myself, I can't take Benadryl. If I take Benadryl, I'm out. Like, I can't operate machinery if I've had a Benadryl at all. Any kind of what are those called? Allergy medication, things like that. Like, they really, really affect me. So I have to avoid things like that if I'm going to be doing anything. And I think it's the same with those things. We need to decide, but we also have to understand that
you really think that Benadryl is similar to cocaine?
In terms of the effect that it has on your ability to, it depends. Like, if we're talking about someone who uses a substance regularly, I would say for me, it just depends on the individual. But I would say it has a similar effect to, prescription opiate type things. I think that both are. It depends on the person, though. It's very, like I'm saying, this is a thin skull argument. It's still, I'm responsible for my behavior on Benadryl. It's not the Benadryl that's the problem. Like, I'm obviously responsible for my own behavior. The same is true of someone who is working in that kind of a situation as well. And it's up to their employer to make those decisions too, whether they want to pay them to work when they may be, unable to work to the best of their ability. Okay,
so you really think, look, I do think it's an insincere argument to pretend that Benadryl is in any way comparable to cocaine. I do think that if you're interrogated by a police officer, if you have a police officer investigating a crime in your life, you actually really want the assurance that police officer is not a drug addict and is not a regular user of a serious drug like cocaine or heroin. I think you very much want that. I think in reality, what you're talking about, offloading the responsibility, it sounds like states' rights arguments. Saying like, okay, well, the government won't decide what drugs you can and can't use. We'll just offload that onto employers. Well, the kind of conflict that creates in society. So now it's going to be up to you. Do you really want it to be your boss who's scrutinizing your sobriety? Do you really want it to be the construction company or the factory owner, or indeed even your boss on the police force and so on?
Well, then it's an issue of like who you work for. Again, I think that in most of those cases that's worked out by the free market. Like, people aren't going to want to work for someone who has unreasonable demands.
Really? Look,
and if someone pays enough for you not to do drugs or of any kind, and that's the same reason why today there's a lot of people who work, for example, in Fort McMurray, and they cannot drink any alcohol when they're working at all. They live in camps where they do not drink any alcohol.
We're not talking about when they're working. We're talking about whether or not you sincerely believe that a police officer can use cocaine multiple times per week.
I think that you are making a false distinction between cocaine and other drugs.
I'm just talking about cocaine. Cocaine.
But you can't only talk about cocaine because
we talk about cocaine and heroin in our email conversation.
But I don't think you can say that only cocaine. You don't want a police officer who does, and I'm sure you would throw into that any illicit substance.
No. I think cocaine and heroin. I think we both know. I just said they're not the same as Benadryl. I think it's an insincere response. I think
I think they're more serious drugs. I'm just saying they affect people differently. People who are regular users of some of those substances, for example, people who take ADHD medications like Ritalin and things like that, those are the same as methamphetamines. Right. They are methamphetamines, and people who take them for the conditions that they have, they function just fine. Like, for someone who does suffer from those diseases, they function perfectly normally. I wouldn't, you wouldn't, but they function normally when they are properly medicated. I mean, I doubt that there's such a use case for cocaine, but I'm just trying to say.
I doubt that also. That's why I wonder why you're raising it.
We shouldn't just dismiss and make answers to them. I'm not qualified to make the answer to that question, but I think that we need to think about it very seriously.
You're not qualified to answer the question of whether or not a police officer investigating a crime and interrogating you should be sober, or should be the kind of person, should be the kind of person who uses cocaine multiple times per week. So we're both grown adults. I'm sorry, I don't know your exact age, but we're not teenagers. I think you know very well the knock-on problems in your life as a whole that cocaine use causes. I mean, to talk about a hangover
is more problems.
You think what causes more problems?
Obviously, one of the challenges with any of these drugs.
So I couldn't hear you. You thought what causes more problems than cocaine?
Oh, that I think that the prohibition causes more problems than.
For the police officer, for a person, you think my life lacking cocaine? This is what we're discussing. I mean,
if he takes cocaine that is legal versus cocaine that is illegal, it makes a big difference in terms of.
But that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about a theoretical situation in which we pass the legislation you've approved of in Colombia, and you think would be good for the future of Canada, in which a police officer can use cocaine multiple times per week.
It depends on how much.
And you don't. I
think you're being disingenuous here because.
In what way? In what way am I being disingenuous?
You're pretending that like this individual, I don't know how much they're taking. They may be taking a microdose. Okay. Who knows? Like I think that's I think, are you trying to say like someone who is completely addicted and out of their mind? Is that what you're kind of trying to argue? Because then in that case, I obviously agree with you. Someone who's functioning normally and taking small amounts of a drug, someone who's taking, for example, something for back pain that's legitimate and prescribed by their physician.
But we're not talking about back pain medicine. We're talking about cocaine.
Okay. If it's affecting their ability to work, then no. I mean, if it's affecting their ability to work, then no.
So do you know any human being who could use cocaine multiple times per week? And you build up tolerance to cocaine, and then you use more. It's a downward spiral. Cocaine has amazing knock-on effects the next morning. I assume you know that, so you've seen it. You've at least seen friends strung out on cocaine. I'm sure you have some recognition and the type of social circle it brings you into and everything else, the kind of bad financial decisions it makes you make. Most rock stars and recording artists, they talk about the fact that they didn't go broke because cocaine was expensive, but when they're high on cocaine, they make terrible decisions and they end up losing millions of dollars. Cocaine leads to irrational, poor decision making in your whole life, to say the least. It has all these knock-on effects. And you're really going to sit here and sustain the argument that you can be a police officer, or that you as a citizen will accept having police officers using cocaine multiple times a week as a civil right. I don't think my position here is like Socrates in that in a classical Socratic dialogue, Socrates' position is not I disagree with you, but I really believe you disagree with you. I think you've been performing acrobatics to try to avoid admitting that no, this is not desirable, no, this is not acceptable, that no, it makes sense to have a rule that says no, the type of responsibility.
The problem for you, so it's the multiple times per week. I'm not sure what the argument is here, because with all drugs, it depends on how much you take. There are certain people who do cocaine irregularly their entire lives. They may do it once a month or something like that. They may do it 2 times in 1 week and never again for 5 years. So those are the kind of things where I think it would make sense for a police department to make the decision that we don't want our employees to use these particular drugs. Absolutely. If that's, I want to move on.
So why? But that is a cop-out. Why is it the employer's choice? Why do I want my employer? In the past, gay rights went the other way. It used to be that employers would say, okay, we're not going to accept you. We're not going to accept school teachers if they're homosexual. The employers used to be able to make all these distinctions. In general, there's been a big movement saying, no, the government is taking those decision powers away from employers. We don't want your employer scrutinizing your sex life or your alcohol life or anything else. That was taken away even from Hollywood. Hollywood lost the right to fire people because they were drunk when they were on set. It's a very interesting legal precedent. That was taken away, and the government creates objective standards shared by everyone for basically how human resources departments operate and these kinds of things. Why would the world be a better place if you hand over to employers this ability? And if you think it is morally possible, but your case still is, you still seem to be saying,
public servants. A policeman is a public servant.
Well,
so
yeah, but we're also talking about pilots.
Is us.
You've already admitted that pilots also can't use cocaine and fly an airplane. I mean, that's
I can.
But for some reason, you think it's ethical for the employer to enforce that policy against pilot and not for the government. Why?
So
why is that
is
better?
The
why?
In this case.
What? So
the government is the employer in this case.
Okay,
and in the airplane case, it is a private business, and they're also.
So you think it's fine if a private business wants to allow its pilots to use cocaine multiple times a week?
Generally speaking, of course. If I do think
so.
That, yeah.
So of course it's okay. You've just said of course it's okay for an airline to decide to allow its pilots to use cocaine multiple times a week. For you as a customer, you'd accept that. You'd accept. How would you know? You don't have the ability. You don't have the ability to interrogate the airline pilot before you get in the plane. You don't have the ability to interrogate the police officer.
They have a general policy that is open to the public. I think
there are real. This is why the government creates and enforces laws. Is because you and I don't have the power to scrutinize a police officer and say, no, you know what? This police officer seems to me like a cokehead. Could you give me another police officer? I don't get that choice. I'm interrogated by any police officer. I don't get to get on the plane. I don't get to get on the plane and give the. Excuse me. I do not get to give the.
I feel like we're at a bottleneck here. I don't want this to be the end of this conversation because this seems like a very silly place to get hung up on this and allow it to become a bottleneck.
But what's silly about it? I mean, as I say, the reason why we have the government creating and enforcing laws, but this is for public safety and this is for public benefit. You've said
people, we vote on them.
Right.
Vote on them. The people can say this is very important. I don't see
so
how.
In Colombia, who voted to make cocaine legal?
Well, the legislature, I would assume.
No, it was a court judgment. It wasn't democratic at all. It was a Supreme Court judgment in Colombia. Okay, so just a moment. Right now, what percentage of the Canadian public do you think would legalize heroin and cocaine, which is your position?
Oh, obviously it would be very, very small.
Okay.
But I think that's because they don't know much about the issues. But I agree, it would be a very small percentage.
Okay, so, the issue of government regulation providing protection for me against the possibility of a police officer being a drug addict, against the possibility of a pilot being a drug addict. I see that as unambiguously positive, and I see it as more ethically positive for the state, for the government, to play that role than for a private company to play that role. I see nothing morally positive about, I would say the opposite. I don't really want Bill Gates and Microsoft or, say, the owner of Starbucks saying, hey, you know what, we're going to start drug testing people, we're going to create our own morality police, we're going to start interrogating things. I think that is a role for the government, and I think it's crucial to my privacy and my freedom, talking about libertarianism, that my employer doesn't play that role.
You just asked me, and I told you multiple times at the beginning, I don't want to be making that decision. I think it should be up to the people. If the people decide that it's something that is important, then obviously we instate it. I don't know about, I can't say for certain, and I hate making statements about things that I don't know for certain.
Okay.
I don't know for certain about the cocaine example, but I obviously believe that, it needs to be duly elected representatives and people making decisions about these things. Like, I think that's important.
Okay. So, look, I do think these kinds of discussions have to have stakes involved. Like, they're not purely hypothetical stuff. I've known people whose lives have been destroyed by drug use, and I've known people who perceive themselves as if their lives were not destroyed by drug use when, in my opinion, they were. And if not destroyed, their lives were at least seriously dented. They may not see it that way. They may think they're having a great time using cocaine or using heroin or using whatever combination of drugs it is they're into. But yes, my judgment is, I look at them from the outside and say, geez, you could have done more with your life. You could have done better if drugs were not a part of it. I mean, it's interesting. I didn't think this conversation would go the way we would, just based on our prior email. No, because it seemed to me that you were really against there being any shame or stigma attached to drug use, and then you say the opposite. It's the opposite to my expectations from the prior email. I think it's totally appropriate. I mean, I have a million brothers, but several of my brothers.
Where did I say that there should be no shame or stigma?
No.
I mean, it's okay if people disapprove of it. I'm not going to outlaw disapproval for it, so please don't think that I'm trying to ban people from disapproving of it. People will. I mean, that's up to them.
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of where this conversation started, I thought exactly what you objected to was someone like myself, in effect, judging drug addicts, having a judgmental attitude towards drug addicts. You came out and you I think, argued that drug addicts should be regarded as kind of passive victims and not, in this case, in a sense, regarded with shame and stigma. No, you're making a decision. You're making a bad decision. But I was just saying, I do regard my own brothers that way. It's not as if someone who's close to me, I regard, if anything, I'm more judgmental because I know more about them. I know more about the opportunities they had or the opportunities they squandered, and I see the drug use in that context, the things I know about their lives. But I don't really, in a sense, judge a homeless person who I just happen to pass in the street, nor a millionaire drug addict whom I happen to pass down at the Millionaires Club or something, who are destroying their lives with drug use because I just don't know that much about them.
Yeah.
However,
to get to my disagreement with the comment you originally made, I just commented because you'd stated that you thought that it was better, the situation in Yunnan than in Canada. You didn't like seeing drug addicts on the street and things like that you found that very distasteful. When I responded that it was because one of the reasons you don't see them on the street in China is because they do have very draconian drug laws. And you basically said if it means killing 50 Canadians a year in order to eliminate the appearance of drug addicts on the street, then it's justified. That's what I was responding to. And if I'm mistaken in that summation of your argument, which I very well might be, then I apologize. But that was my understanding.
That is a false summation of my argument, but I can see why you took it that way. I was basically just questioning the significance of the number 2,000. ModVegan presented this number that said, well, China has executed about 2,000 people per year. By the way, that's a dramatic decline. They had a peak of 12,000 per year. And I pointed in response, well, it's 2,000 people being executed, and this is for all crimes combined, not just for drug offenses. And China's population is so enormous, if you compare that to the population of Canada, that would be the equivalent of Canada executing 50 people a year. So my point was just this is not tremendous.
Okay.
Now, conversely...
So that was my only, in terms of my serious objection to what you were saying, that I just felt like that was seemed like an immoral statement to me, but I misunderstood.
It's fine. But there are other moral judgments involved here, but that's not one of them. You're in a tiny, tiny minority of people who support the position you do, and you've conceded that point. Yeah. In the minority with you is Milton Friedman. So I don't know if you know that. Okay, Milton Friedman, he this is almost a direct quote, but a slight paraphrase. He said, if people want to kill themselves, the government should just sit back and let them. Now, I'm not only willing to concede, I'm willing to very much discuss and examine the disadvantages of the body count that's produced by enforcing drug laws. Now, there is a body count, and this is one of the reasons why I mentioned speed limits repeatedly. Enforcing speed limits also has a body count. Having the cops pursue and stop someone who's speeding creates accidents, creates a certain number of deaths per year that would not happen if the cops chose to ignore them. And in some jurisdictions around the world, they actually have laws to that effect, where if they're speeding over a certain level, the police are ordered not to pursue to avoid causing more accidents.
Not to interrupt, but like the Autobahn, it has a ridiculously high speed limit, and it does results in they have fewer accidents there as well. So to me, that seems like an obvious decision. Obviously, we want to be careful about people driving recklessly, but I do.
I don't actually think that's why they did that on the Autobahn. That's kind of a separate story. But
it's also good for traffic congestion and things like that.
My point is, look, I am willing to discuss the body count of enforcing the law. Enforcing speed limits does create a body count. I think the other side, if there was someone in this conversation saying they'd prefer to live in a society with no speed limits, you said you had mixed feelings on that. Maybe not. But if there was someone saying they'd rather live in a society with no speed limits, they must be willing to admit there's also a body count for having no speed limits.
Not to bring up the horrible cocaine discussion again, but I would say that the speed limit example and the cocaine example are similar in that both of them can be very dangerous. Nobody's denying that those things are very dangerous and very deadly. Speeding can kill people, all that stuff. It's just, I think that there's a lot of deciding the benefits and risks and things involved. That's all.
So I do not see Milton Friedman's position as compassionate. I don't see it as helping people. I see it as a policy that will have both a significant body count, i.e. people who overdose or people who just use drugs moderately until they die, who disappear and very gradually are killed. Because, heroin especially, people can use for 20 years and die very gradually, but they're dead to the world long before that. In many ways, mentally, they've destroyed themselves. Long before physically they wither away. Cocaine is relatively fast death. I don't think. I mean, sorry. This is my belief or my preferred policy. I think that intervention benefits some of those people, and I concede, just like stopping people who are speeding in a car, it kills some of them. Like, I don't think. Let me just say this. This is a concession. I don't think you can justify enforcing speed limits as saving lives. That would be too simple. Enforcing speed limits saves some lives, and it kills some people. Having absolutely no speed limits will also kill some people. I think you have to concede, and this is on a massive scale, having both a culture and a legal system that is permissive towards drugs in exactly the sense, legalizing cocaine, legalizing heroin, it will kill people. It also has a price in blood. People will die, and people will have their lives destroyed, ruined, without actually dying. Significant numbers of people.
I agree completely, and I think that's where a lot of this comes down to. I think you're absolutely right. When we look at deaths from drug overdoses around the world and things like that, it's even very difficult to determine, and I'll concede this as someone who is an advocate of drug legalization for all drugs. I do think that when you look at the world, if you look at the United Nations Office of Drug Control Policy and things like that, if you look at the statistics, it's difficult to say if really addiction numbers are higher in countries that have draconian drug laws or in countries that don't. Like, there's examples like you have like China and things like that where they may be slightly smaller. There's also countries that have very draconian policies, like Iran.
Well, but even Los Angeles or something, just say,
where 14% of the adult population are drug addicts. You know? So you can have very, very harsh laws and have a lot of drug use. So I think we totally agree about that. I would say that I almost feel that in my case, I would see that the victim of the draconian drug policy is easy access to treatment and things like that, because I do think it's a health issue, it's a wellness issue, it's not a crime issue. I think that that's something that is lost somewhat when you have draconian policies, but I also will concede, I think in your case, what you're saying, what is lost is morality. I think for you, if you legalize drugs, you lose morality. I think that's kind of what you're saying. You don't like that Milton Friedman is not compassionate. And perhaps he's not compassionate, but he is giving people the right to make those decisions for themselves. And he feels that that's more important, that their right to make decisions for themselves really supersedes any right of the government to interfere and make those decisions on an individual's behalf. And I think that is an important right, a sacrosanct right, that does need to be protected. But for you, I think more than the individual liberty, it's the morality of living in a world where
I don't
like it's kind of dark and cold and moralist.
I don't believe my own brothers have the right to use cocaine or heroin, and I do have some brothers who've used both and other drugs beside. I don't think they should. I don't think they should boast publicly about it, and they do. I don't think they should feel comfortable. I think they should feel ashamed of their past drug use or present drug use. My brothers are older than I am now, so some of them have moved on. I think living in a culture where shame and fear are attached to that kind of drug use, again, we're talking about cocaine and heroin here, is in many ways appropriate, given the nature and consequences of that drug use for the person using themselves and for anyone surrounding them. I mean, the consequences of your father becoming a cocaine user for the child are unbelievably devastating. We now have this also with some of the oxycodone, some of the painkiller. Having a parent of a child become a drug addict. And what you're saying is, if you're talking about a single mom or something, if you're talking about a mother who doesn't have a job, you want to remove the role of any possible state agency in taking her and putting her into a treatment center, or indeed put her into prison, so that you want only the employer to enforce drug laws, although strangely you want them to probably enforce the same standards I want.
I'm not entirely certain about that with the employer.
Okay. I'm sorry. But to me, this is about the equality of humanity for me.
I can tell you with the parents, because you were just bringing up the topic of the single mother. If the child is in danger, if the child of these people are in danger, just like with anything else, obviously I haven't gotten rid of, the child has rights too, and they're not being protected by the parent. The state needs to intervene and protect the child.
But when I relate to a police officer, I need the police officer is in loco parentis. I need that police officer to use his authority responsibly to protect me. You were just using the word protection. Why would I accept a police officer using cocaine multiple times a week? Why would I accept a parent, a mother or a father, using cocaine multiple times a week. I think both are unacceptable for the same reason. And I don't think we can have two classes of humanity where we say, okay, parents and police can't use cocaine multiple times a week and everyone else can, or some other class of people can't. That's incoherent to me.
If you are endangering someone, to me, it's very clear. The difference is if you're putting someone else in danger. If the police officer, if we have evidence that puts people in danger more than Lipitor, then obviously the government, whatever. I'll give you that. The government can make a law that police officers cannot do those things.
But I profoundly believe that we're equal to police officers and that we are putting other people in danger. I think that if I work on a construction site,
are you?
I'm being very sincere. Let me say, my professors at university, some of my professors have been drug users. Drug addiction exists amongst university professors, and what happens with their authority, which is not the authority to physically handcuff people, but when professors misuse their authority, it has unbelievably devastating effects on the lives of their students for decades. Sorry?
And they can get fired, obviously, for that. It's more difficult in the case of professors. It's a good example because they're hard to fire. But generally,
it's a good example. And the employer is not interested in enforcing those laws. The employer is not interested is not interested in taking the student's side. It's not convenient. And so you and I probably both have known some examples of professors who were at least alcoholics, if not into cocaine and other drugs. I just say we're not going to name names. I know examples of that. Okay, you've now sort of conceded a criterion here if it negatively impacts other people whom you have some kind of power for. All of us have that kind of power. Whether it's me as a parent to my five-year-old daughter, sorry, she's turning 5 soon. She's actually not 5 yet as we record this. Whether it's me as a parent to my 5-year-old daughter, birthday's coming up, or it's a professor in his classroom, or it's a construction worker. And believe me, on construction sites, drugs are a big issue. But for me, I think the unexamined life is not worth living for men, for all of mankind. I don't look at a construction worker as inferior.
Because if everybody is equally important, we all need to live these clear-headed lives.
Right.
How many drugs?
That's okay. It's a great question. That's a great question. But I've already got an answer. Japan has already done it. I don't have to point to some kind of hypothetical paradise scenario. Countries like Japan have already made heroin illegal and cocaine illegal, and they've made some classes of addictive pain pills illegal too, which is interesting to note. Some pain pills
that are drugs are not nearly as damaging as alcohol. Alcohol is far more damaging than those drugs are. So I don't see how.
So that's a perfectly reasonable counterargument.
And we've seen the result of banning alcohol.
That is a perfectly reasonable counterargument. But here's my counterargument to that. So like nicotine. Also, you can argue, causes cancer. But nicotine and alcohol, I'm also against, sorry. For anyone who's new to the channel, I'm also against cigarettes and alcohol. Babe, could you bring me some water? Sorry, I have no water here. My girlfriend's in the kitchen. Sorry. This has been a discussion without a break for water. If you're getting on an airplane and you see the pilot standing in front of the airplane before he goes in to fly it, and he's just finished smoking a cigarette, and he stubs out the cigarette, that doesn't present the same problem for his competence to fly the airplane as if he's just snorted cocaine.
Or drunk alcohol.
Right. I would say,
2 hours
right.
Or something. There's some rules of. I think it's quite a bit more than that for alcohol. And that's how they
with alcohol. With alcohol.
With alcohol.
With alcohol, I think it is possible to drink alcohol multiple times per week and still be a pilot. I don't recommend it. I think you'd have, you can imagine what the problems are already. I recommend everyone be sober. But is it possible for a pilot to drink alcohol on Saturday and be hungover on Sunday and fly an airplane on Monday? It's not only possible, it's really happening. All over the world, pilots are doing that. Is it possible, but by contrast, is it possible for a pilot to have, or a police officer or a parent to have that kind of habit with cocaine and heroin? No, I think there are significant differences here. And that's why I think the people in Japan, I don't think the Japanese are perfect. Believe me, I've studied Japan, formerly University. Japan has all kinds of political and social problems. It's messed up. I'm not glorifying Japan. But my point is also, you asked two totally good questions. First, you asked, okay, well, how do you decide what drugs are legal and which are illegal? And I say, I already agree with the standard that's there in Japan. So I don't want something impossible or unattainable. And then two, you asked, well, what is the difference between cocaine and heroin? and alcohol, and I added in cigarettes from there. And I answered, I think there really is a difference. Sorry, go ahead and speak. I have one more example. But, sorry,
I mean, I don't.
Hogging the
I
microphone.
think in terms of like the likelihood of people becoming addictive, of ruining their lives, alcohol has a far greater potential for abuse than most drugs that we have that are illegal. There are a few that are greater. Heroin is one, but there are not that many drugs that are worse than alcohol in terms of the effect that they have on people. They are used. The interesting thing is also when you talk about addiction rates for alcohol are higher than with many other drugs, including things like cocaine.
Right.
More people do become addicted to alcohol, and it negatively affects their lives. So, and we've seen how bad prohibition has been. I do think that we may want to make a rule that pilots shouldn't drink at all ever, and maybe that will be something that will be a class of people, which I'm completely fine with that. I know you are not. But I'm fine with having different rules for different people. That's not a problem for me.
Right. I want all of us to be first-class citizens and none of us to be second-class citizens. I want to be in there with the pilots and police officers.
It makes you someone who chooses an occupation that does not require a complete alertness at all times.
I think it leads to exactly the situation where the police see the drug addicts on the street and they say, oh, that's okay for you people. That's okay for those people. That's the attitude it fosters.
That has nothing.
No, but we're talking about it as a legal problem and so look, you used a couple of terms which are totally legitimate terms, but they're not part of my approach to this issue. You talked about the amount of harm, and you talked about the propensity for addiction. I've been involved with a couple of museum projects. This one I was just a little bit involved with. The Opium Museum in northern Thailand. I met the director and founder and planner of that museum. And I asked him, I had a series of questions for the interview, and the final question I asked him was, were there any exhibits from the museum that were censored, the government didn't want you to have in, about opium? And he said yes. One of them was a display. He wanted to have kind of an octagonal room with a big portrait of the whole human body showing the nervous system, and to show for each of the drugs what the effects on the nervous system were. So, alcohol, nicotine, the legal drugs, well, the illegal drugs. And, of course, it made heroin seem harmless. Because the effects, listing the chart, listing the heroin seems harmless compared to these other drugs, right? My argument is not based on harm, and it's not based on propensity for addiction. It's based on responsibility. It's based on decision making. It's based on use of authority, and that's why, again, I talk about a police officer. I don't accept.
If you're talking about the authority, I think you are really referring to a harm-based argument because you were saying that it causes a harm, aren't you?
No, because for me, it's ultimately just philosophical. It's about a life that's not worth living.
Okay, so obviously, I totally just to interrupt, I totally disagree with you there, but that's again because I have a different approach to stuff. Like with the police officer, when I talk about the cocaine, the reason why I was hesitant to make a statement about how often they use and things like that is because we do have evidence. I was just reading an article from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And they were talking about there are frequent users of cocaine, so that's why I was bringing up that. There are frequent users of cocaine who are not addicted, who go about their daily lives. I have known them in my personal life. And as you say, the cost does eventually become an issue. However, I would say, I'm just talking about people that I've known in my own life, people with even heroin. I knew a guy in university who was in the ROTC. He drove across the border. Oh God, I hope he's not watching this. Anyway, but he drove across the border and did his ROTC training. He was at school in Vancouver. He would drive down to Seattle and do his, just Bellingham across the border, do his training. He was addicted to heroin, I would say. He might not say he was addicted, but he was definitely a habitual user. It was something that he did on a regular basis. He abused the drug regularly, I suppose. But it didn't interfere with his ability to be a straight A student. It didn't interfere with his ability to be on a student, to be involved at a high level within academia and the university, to be an outstanding student with ROTC. He did very well. Apparently, they did not do regular drug testing in those days.
Right, but for your own daughter, that's not good enough, I assume. If your own daughter is using heroin multiple times per week.
Use of these kinds of drugs, I do think that it belies people who use illicit drugs in the first place. I think it shows that they have judgment issues and things like that.
All right, but with all due respect, that's kind of taking off in another direction.
But I'm just trying to say the reason why I would say that with him is that quite honestly, in terms of abuse of power and things like that, this was a stellar individual, you know, and he was also a teaching assistant. He was a stellar individual.
He's a stellar crackhead. That's what he is.
No, well, he was heroin, but he was a stellar student, stellar teacher. He certainly didn't abuse his power. I can only think of maybe 2 people that knew about this.
Okay.
But
if you helped him quit heroin, would that be helping him?
Oh yes, I'm not saying all drug use is good, Eisel. This is not the argument. I'm not saying everyone should go do drugs. Please, that is not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying that when I look at someone like him, I've known also people who used cocaine habitually, and until it became a financial issue, most of them functioned very well. And while I don't necessarily think those people should become police officers, I know police officers who have far greater problems with alcohol. It does interfere with their ability to carry out their duties, as you say, with your professor example. And as long and drawn out and painful as our argument was about cocaine, that is why I stuck to my guns a bit on that. Probably shouldn't have. But if you can understand now,
you stated your position that it's acceptable for police officers to use cocaine multiple times per week.
Well,
you can retract it now if you're convinced otherwise. I'd be very happy to hear.
Can you understand my position? What I'm trying to explain here, what I'm trying to say is that for many people, and when you look at the statistics, for many of the people who use these drugs, they are not demonstrably, it's not affecting their lives, it's not affecting the quality of their work any more than people who drink, and that is a substance that's legal and allowed.
If your own daughter says to you in the future, Mom, I use cocaine multiple times per week, and it's not affecting me in any way. Don't worry, it's not affecting my life in any way. Now,
I think that
I would not even believe my daughter if she just told me, Dad, I've started watching NFL football for 10 hours a week. A lot of people do that, but it's not affecting my life in any way. I wouldn't accept that argument for football, and watching football doesn't cause brain damage. I assume you know about MRI scan and the real effect on the human brain of cocaine.
Yes,
That's not debatable.
No, but it also, obviously, as we were saying, alcohol has just it can often have just as great an influence, and that's why I know you don't drink. It does have a huge influence on people. If my daughter told me that she was drinking to pass out multiple times a week, obviously, with either one of these things, I would be concerned. I would want to, investigate treatment options and help her. But do I think that she should be locked up, that making it illegal, forcing her to get her medication, these substances on the black market? Do I think that would be a better thing for her, a better thing for society? I absolutely do not. Having people buy adulterated drugs that will kill them, it's bad for crime, it's bad for people as individuals. And we see that in Switzerland. There was a wonderful program that they've even done, I think in Ontario recently, where they're giving people alcohol. So this is just for alcohol in Canada. They're doing it with heroin in Switzerland, but they are doing it with alcohol in Canada. For alcoholics, they're giving them the amount of alcohol that they need every week, and not trying to get them off alcohol necessarily. Some people have gotten clean thanks to the program because they give them access to information and education. If they can improve their lives if they choose, but if they don't, they found the difference is none of these people are engaging
We're not actually discussing treatment and harm reduction methods. You go to Colombia sometimes.
You asked me about my daughter.
Yeah.
So I'm just
in the future, your daughter could go to Colombia again. You've been to Colombia many times, and your daughter could go back at any time. You have connections to Colombia. And in Colombia, using cocaine is legal. What would be your moral basis for objecting to your daughter? It's a civil right. She can go and buy cocaine legally and apparently morally in Cambodia. In Colombia, not Cambodia. A little slip there. She can buy it and use it multiple times per week, and you're going to have to sit and eat this argument that you can still be a stellar student and do just great using hard drugs. The medical reality, meanwhile, the medical reality is that it causes brain damage. It causes permanent brain, just like huffing glue, right?
Yeah, no, it causes brain damage.
But it's perfectly legal in Colombia.
Many drugs.
So why is it not okay? Why is it not okay for your daughter to use cocaine in Colombia multiple times per week, but it is okay for everyone else? What's the difference?
It's not okay. I'm not saying that it doesn't mean that they don't need help. If they're using drugs as a means of escape, it doesn't mean that they don't need help. I think we should obviously give those people help. I think you're misunderstanding the difference between making something illegal, whether that is a good in and of itself, because that's kind of your argument is that it's a good in and of itself. It's an end in itself to make drugs illegal. I'm saying it is not. I want to see people get off of drugs. It's not that I think they should be taking drugs that are harmful to them. I just think that we need to not, that the drug war has caused far more problems than it's worth.
So the position of Milton Friedman was, if people want to kill themselves, the government should stand back and let it. And you agreed, but not with your own daughter.
No. I think that we're disagreeing here. The argument, if you think back to the discussion with Milton Friedman, the reason he's saying that in that interview
is that you said that because the right of the individual to make that decision is of paramount importance. So the right of your own daughter to start using cocaine multiple times per week.
I disagree with myself. I don't disagree with what I said. I agree. But people should be allowed to do whatever they want if it's gonna, I don't disagree with that.
So your daughter can huff glue, and your daughter can use cocaine multiple times a week. And that's fine because it's her personal choice. And there's no argument as to why a democratically elected government would outlaw a substance that causes brain damage.
This seems so pointless. The thing is that you're saying that it should be illegal. I'm saying that it should be legal. Yes, it should be legal. It already is legal for you to go down to the grocery store and buy glue and kill yourself. I mean, that is
it's not legal to use glue as a mind-altering substance. It's not. I'm just mentioning. It's legal to use the glue paper, but it's not legal to put in your nose.
It's fine. Eisel, it's legal to go, where I live, to go to the liquor store, buy 5 bottles of vodka and drink myself to death.
Right.
It is perfectly legal.
Yes.
And what Milton Friedman was saying in that sentence when he was talking, he was saying it should be just as legal for someone to go and do that with illicit substances as it is with alcohol. It does not mean that we don't believe. It does not mean that people who advocate drug legalization don't believe that we shouldn't have strategies to help people with addiction, to get them out of addiction, to get them out of drug use. I don't think that everyone should be using drugs. I don't know how many times I have to say that, but I don't want my daughter using drugs. I don't want you using drugs. I don't want your daughter using drugs. But I do think that drugs should be legal. I don't think it's up for the law to tell people what they can and cannot do. I think it's in these situations what we want to be doing is working on the harm reduction.
So you're mixing in prescriptive and descriptive facts. You think it should not be for the law to do that, but it is. The law sets a speed limit. The law sets an age of consent for sex. In some places it's 16, in some places it's 18, whatever. But there's a law. There's a minimum age. There's a maximum speed limit. There's a minimum age for consent. Right? Those are the rules we play by.
Yes.
And
I don't disagree with you. That is the law.
Right. So why this extraordinary exception when there's a drug, there's a substance that causes brain damage, that destroys people's lives, that I think you have to concede your own daughter's life, in all probability, would be destroyed or negatively impacted by using cocaine multiple times a week or heroin multiple times a week. Why does it seem suddenly that the remit of democracy that includes sex and speeding tickets and starting wars, that it stops with cocaine and heroin? Why should those be beyond the reach of legislation? There seems to be no coherent argument, and it puts you, I think, in a hypocritical position in terms of your relationship to the police and your relationship to your professor, your relationship to your own daughter, in terms of authority in both ways.
I'm not advocating that people use illegal drugs, if that's what you think that I'm saying.
No, you're advocating that they should be made legal.
Should be legal. It's not that people should do illegal drugs. I just hope that's clear.
Okay, but can you answer the question? I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, I did ask a question there about, why would this be outside of the scope of legislation? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Oh no, I don't mean, not that outside the scope of legislation. I think that it should be, that we should legalize drugs. That's what I.
So in this conversation, I haven't put much emphasis on brain damage. I think there is a straight argument to be made just in terms of some things are so unhealthy they should be illegal, and brain damage is in a special class. And I think actually you agree with me, even though it's inconvenient for you to agree with me. And I'm not gonna push on that. But I think there's just an argument that certain types of gasoline. Jet fuel type things. I'm sorry, I don't think jet fuel itself is an example. Maybe it is. There are certain types of fuels and chemicals used in industry where there are very strict guidelines about being exposed to it because it can cause cancer or it can cause brain damage, and we have those guidelines for those things. I don't see any reason why we can't just make cocaine illegal because it causes brain damage, period. That's a completely sufficient reason for that.
Do you support medically assisted suicide?
sorry, medically assisted suicide. Okay, I can say this. In cases where the person is able to express their wish, I don't think it's a problem. I'm sorry, I was a member of the Buddhist religion for many years, and it's actually a really big deal within Buddhism. The main problems we get into are cases where the person hasn't been able to speak for 10 years or something. Yeah. So that's kind of different. But if you're talking about someone who themselves makes a rational decision to commit suicide, no, I don't have a problem with that. Whether their will has been stated and it's clear. For example, in Canada, we have the DNR laws for that, the do not resist.
Yeah, and I completely agree.
Okay.
How is that in any way, shape, or form measurably different from believing that what Milton Friedman said? Because that's what he's saying. He's not saying that it's a good thing. He's saying that it should not be made illegal to end your life. Okay. He's saying that if you want to end your life or to do something that could endanger your life, you have pharmacological hegemony over your own body. You have the right. You have autonomy to choose what substances go in your body. That's what he's saying.
Right. I think that's a very.
I don't agree with necessarily those substances.
I think that's a very insincere argument on your part, because if your daughter goes to a nightclub in Medellin and someone offers her cocaine, where it's legal for her to use cocaine, they're not offering her an electric chair to kill herself. Say, hey, do you want to sit on this electric chair and sign this form so you can commit suicide? That's a choice. That's a choice your daughter can make. And you and I both agree, I think, in principle, that if for some reason your daughter does decide to commit suicide, she can under certain circumstances, like signing a form. There's no ambiguity. That's okay. But she would know what she's choosing. And when you choose cocaine, when your daughter goes to a nightclub and chooses cocaine, she's not choosing an electric chair. She's not choosing a noose around her neck. She's choosing a very appealing and socially acceptable and fun substance.
Yeah, I have to make a point right here that I think is very important.
Right.
While drug use is legal in Colombia, like for personal use, it is not legal to sell it. And so that means that if you purchase drugs, she could be buying anything. And that's what I think creates the most harm, because that is what matters to me. The greatest harm for people going to nightclubs in Colombia is caused by the fact that they have no idea what on earth they're getting. I mean, I've never done drugs in my life.
So do you really believe that? Do you really believe that the low quality of cocaine causes more harm than cocaine?
Adulteration and things like that. Like when people think that they're getting something and they get something else. That's something we hear about every day, with people getting all sorts of weird and crazy adulterated substances. Fentanyl obviously kills people in Canada every single day.
I don't know if you're aware of the extent to which you're misdirecting the argument here, but you're responding to my question by saying the consequences for your daughter using cocaine are trivial compared to the issue of whether your daughter uses high quality or low quality cocaine. That if your daughter's going to use cocaine, you want her to use pure, good quality cocaine. I find that a remarkable misdirection of the topic we're discussing.
Obviously,
I mean, that may be a legitimate problem for the cokeheads out there, trying to get good quality cocaine.
You're trying to say that somehow I wouldn't mind that my daughter would do these things, and I find that an insincere argument as well. I feel like that this is getting to be such a toxic argument, but what I'm trying to say is, like, obviously with all these things, I don't want anyone in my life doing anything that will harm them.
The question I've asked you repeatedly, which you have refused to answer, you've given kind of irrelevant things, was why would legislation end here? In terms of the brain damage argument, we had a very clear thing where I said, look, so let's say there's some chemical used in industry. We can make up an imaginary chemical. Exposure to this chemical is dangerous. It maybe causes brain damage, or it maybe causes other health problems, and we have government rules and regulations about using it. Okay? Cocaine is dangerous. Cocaine causes brain damage. Why is ecological legislation okay? Why is health and safety legislation okay, and cocaine is not?
More than I can stop her. I can't stop my daughter from doing absolutely stupid, dangerous things. People jump out of buildings. They run their heads into walls. Like, people do very dangerous things. How should I be saying that I should stop her from doing this particular dangerous thing more than all others?
Yes, so I have an answer for you.
It's a dangerous thing, and I do think, even in the case of my daughter in Colombia.
I have an answer for you, and it's very close. You said, how do I stop my daughter? Arrest. The word arrest literally means stop. If you live in Japan, if you live in a country where drug use is illegal, if your daughter is choosing to use cocaine, you have the power of arrest. You can intervene with a police officer, and you can take her off to a rehab clinic where she doesn't have a choice. where you say, look, guess what? This is a choice you legally can make. And if you're in if you're in Colombia now, you're giving that up. If in the future Canada has the same laws as Colombia, where it's her civil right to have cocaine for her personal use, then you can't do that. You can't stop her. You can't arrest her. You can't intervene in this because it's legally permitted. If that's the future you want, the generalized argument made is for legalizing drugs. That's the difference between an illicit and an illicit drug is the power of arrest. And again, you've never answered my question. So what? Health and safety.
The answer is obviously yes. Obviously, I think that regardless, obviously it's my own child, so I have a different attachment to that child, that personal individual. But they do have rights to make decisions for themselves. So just like anyone else. So I think you want me to be really horrified at my answer. I feel like that's what you're trying to get from me, but I'm not. It doesn't frighten or horrify me. I would be very sad, but my answer is still the same.
Okay, so you come from a school of thought where, like Milton Friedman, I think you regard the people you're legislating with a kind of callous indifference. You say things like, let the free market decide, let them kill themselves, let them use drugs today. And I look at all of humanity as one class, and I think the role of the legislator is to love all mankind as much as I love my own daughter. And to say, in the same way that I don't want my daughter to live this life, I think that the life of a cocaine addict is not worth living for my daughter, and I don't think it's worth living for your daughter and his daughter and her son and everyone else. I don't want two classes of humanity. Neither an elite of people I care about like my daughter, nor an elite like police officers. I have standards of what makes life worth living and not worth living, like slavery and abolishing slavery, like addiction to hard drugs like cocaine and heroin, and I want to abolish and remove them for everyone, not just for my daughter and not just for the police officer, but for all mankind. So I have a morally consistent position, and I do not see a limit to the role of a democratic legislature when it comes to cocaine any more than I do for toxic chemicals used in industry or environmental regulations or health and safety regulations. Life involves making hard choices, and countries like Japan have already done it. It's not a future utopia.
I agree with you. I would, and if I was going to be difficult here, I think the thing is that when you say that I'm being callous and
I think you imagine the role of the legislator that way as callous, the hypothetical legislator.
Yeah, you feel that the role of the legislator is being callous, I suppose. But how callous is it to remove someone's autonomy to decide for them what the good is for them?
I would do that for my daughter, and I think you would do that for your daughter also. You would say, look, hun, sorry, I don't know your daughter's name, but look, honey, I'm just using honey as a placeholder. Yeah. You're here in the slums of Medellin using cocaine multiple times a week. You think it's not impacting your life negatively, but it is. I would intervene if my daughter got addicted to watching NFL football. And there's no brain damage involved, and there's no crime involved. I'm totally willing to play that role. There, as I say, also, you have, I think, pretended that it would be less invasive to have employers playing that role, and I disagree. I think it is fundamentally less invasive to have the state, because the state has checks and balances. The state has responsibility to a legislature and to the press and everything else. It's a lot more transparent than when Microsoft, your employer, is doing it or somebody else is doing it, right? I'm way more comfortable with the police reading my secret emails to find out whether or not I'm a drug dealer than my employer doing it. My employer, it's probably easier for him to read my emails. These are real differences. Yes. But you did just say, I agree with you on something. I'm not sure what it is you agree with me on.
Oh. I'm not sure what
you did say that. I'm not sure, but you said there was something you in fact agree with me on. So okay.
But what I can say, let me try and organize my thoughts here.
Good.
When it comes to the daughter example again, I want to be there for my daughter. I want to show her that I am there for her when she is ready to get help. That I am there. That I will offer her all of the assistance that she needs in order to get off of these drugs. I will talk to her. I will tell her that I think what she's doing is dangerous.
Right.
I will tell her that it is harmful. I will tell her that I am concerned for her mental health and her well-being. What I will not do is use force to try and accomplish the ends that I believe are right for her. If she's, over the age of 18, etc. If she's an emancipated adult, I will not do that, and I don't expect the state to do that either. I think that there is a certain amount of freedom that we have to give people
There
in order
is.
for them to be able to appreciate the lives that they have.
Look at Japan. They all live in freedom. Japan isn't a giant prison.
No, I'm not saying.
People have plenty of freedom in
and
Japan.
the people of Japan are free to make whatever laws they want. And obviously, I'm aware of the fact
It's not a terrible dictatorship.
No. And I'm very aware of the fact that my views on this issue are extremely unpopular. I would say that if I were to ever be talking about public policy and things like that, this is already happening, but in Canada, I believe that legalizing marijuana is the right way to go. I probably would never advocate publicly, even though I have made my position known. I would probably not advocate publicly for legalizing heroin and cocaine and things like that. I think that that is a much greater hurdle to overcome. I think that people are not ready for something like that. But I do hold the beliefs that I hold, and I know that you hold the beliefs that you hold. You mentioned that you would rather live in a place like Japan than in a place like Amsterdam, and that is something that is a decision that you
on
get
this
to
issue. We're not talking about other things. We're not talking about veganism or something. I think veganism's better in Amsterdam. But
I do think that Amsterdam, unfortunately, thanks to the prohibitionist attitude of the United States, they have a very prohibitionist attitude towards drugs as well. So I don't think that Amsterdam is like this drug of paradise that you portray it as. It's not like but I hope that I made my attitude clear on my daughter. Like the daughter example, the government example. The government's role is to be there, to be telling children that drugs are dangerous, to be educating them, to help educate the public, to be there constantly with free education, with free, especially because I think this is a little bit easier to get in Canada than in the United States, but I know people in the United States. My mom has a very good friend, and her son has been addicted to heroin and opiates for, God, way too many years.
Right.
And it has destroyed their family financially because they don't have healthcare. And so so I do recognize that it's very important to offer those treatment programs, to make them available to everyone. So I agree with you 100% about that. It needs to be for everyone. The assistance needs to be...
But voluntary. But entirely voluntary. Because if you're in a country, if you're in a carry...
I think it needs to be voluntary.
So if you're in a country...
sick, as in, like, if you can say that someone's sick, like in a hospital situation, you know, when people come in and they're sick and they can't...
so that means you have situations... That means you have situations where there's a single mom who uses cocaine multiple times per week and is raising her kids, and it's completely her civil right to go on using cocaine multiple times per week while raising her kids. The state has no ability to arrest her, to put her into a rehab facility. No, but that's real. And it means there will be police officers who use cocaine multiple times a week, and that's their civil right. They can go on being a crackhead and a police officer. That is exactly the world you're signing up for. And I think you accept, in terms of the rates of cocaine and heroin use, if they are legal, as you say, the number of people using them, the body count, and the number of lives destroyed, it will increase. I don't think dramatically. In the same way, I think if speed limits are abolished, most people will continue to drive the same way most of the time without any speed limits. But once in a while, people will drive faster.
It's going to increase substantially. I think that when people have the ability to get the treatment and help that they need, I think that will help address a lot of those issues. I mean, addiction is an issue that generally it's related to all sorts of other mental health and wellness issues. It's not just...
I'm sorry. What is your claim here? That only crazy people use cocaine? That's ridiculous.
Well, it's people who don't mind.
Why not just retract that? What rational... You've just been arguing before. Your contradiction before you argued that highly effective people who still have a job and still go to work make the decision to use cocaine and use heroin. So you can't now play the other card and say, anyone who's an addict is insane as mental health.
Here. With drugs like cocaine that tend to improve performance, at least in the short term, and things like that, the people that use them do tend, like when you look at them on a psychological scale, most of them have very low inhibitions before they're taking the cocaine. There are people who are willing to break the law, people who don't mind doing those kinds of things. With legalization, it isn't even as attractive. So I think the idea that it's going to increase dramatically just because of that.
It's going to increase what? It's going to increase. My claim was if cocaine is legal as opposed to illegal, more people will use cocaine.
Yeah, I think more people may try it. I doubt that it would be a large increase in users.
Right? Once you have a society where cocaine doesn't have fear attached to it and doesn't have negative stigma attached to it, More people will use cocaine. Some of those people will become addicts. Some of them will die of drug overdose. Some of them will destroy their lives. I'm sorry. What do you mean we can't do? How does legalizing cocaine create a superpower?
People don't.
How does it create a superpower or an unlimited budget for governments to do what Japan? Do you think Japan lacks those things? That's a complete lie. Look, you're setting up many things here that are just factually not true. But I mean,
say exactly what did I say that was factually not true?
Sorry. That somehow drugs being illegal in Japan makes it difficult or impossible for people to get treatment.
What it does is it makes it more difficult for people to admit that they have a problem. It makes it more difficult. Most people who are using drugs have a difficult time admitting that they have a problem. They have a difficult time seeking help. It is a lot easier if there's less stigma attached to it.
And more people will use the drug. This is how we started, talking about veganism and stigma and fear. So you accept more people will use the drug, more people will have brain damage, more people will have their lives dented and destroyed by drug use and by drug addiction.
I don't these are that because I think one of the reasons that people even use drugs today is because they start out with things like marijuana and alcohol that are more readily available. They're already doing something that's illegal. Have
you ever used any of these drugs, or are you someone who's been sober?
No, I've never used any of these drugs. I'm referring specifically to public policy, so I can't say. But in terms of what we know from drug research, we know that people tend to use those harder drugs.
So you don't think rational people use cocaine because it's fun?
Oh no!
I
do think
this is ridiculous. On the one hand, you want to claim
much fun off of from other things if they were more available. There's all sorts of reasons that people. Yeah.
Mod, you've never used cocaine.
No, I've never used cocaine.
That earlier in this conversation, you thought cocaine was comparable to Benadryl.
No, in terms of the effect, in terms of
right. That's what's mind blowing to me. Let me tell you something. The effects of cocaine.
It affects my ability to perform. Like if I was to try to be a police officer or something, and I took Benadryl, I would have a very hard time even staying awake.
You don't think you could use Benadryl 3 times a week without destroying your career as a cop? I think you can, and I think you can't use.
Maybe. I mean, yeah.
You can't use cocaine 3 times a week.
I would
without
perform suboptimally. Let's just say that I would be doing suboptimal performance. I'm not trying to. I'm just saying that it's different for different people. A drug like Benadryl that affects me a lot. Other people can take it every single day, multiple times a day, and be completely alert at all times and be fine. So,
I think you're deeply in denial about many things here, including the nature of what these drugs are and what their effects on people are. I mean, it's mind blowing to me. I mean, your response to my saying people use cocaine because it's fun was, well, they can find other ways of having fun. Who are you now, Nancy Reagan? Like, what is this? This makes no sense. This makes no sense. If cocaine is cheap and legal and available with no impurities, which you've said you desire, so high quality cocaine available at low prices with no stigma and no fear and no law against it, more people are going to use it, and it's nothing like signing up to commit suicide, which was your DNR tag or it is nothing like that. Okay. Cocaine affects you mentally, psychologically, sexually. It affects your sense of self-esteem, your sense of physical strength, your endurance, your experience of pain. Cocaine, as they say in the parlance of our times, is one hell of a drug. And I think the fact that you've never done it, I think you've come into this thinking you're the worldly sophisticated one, and you're naive as a 12th grader on this issue. I think you have no idea what kind of Pandora's box you're talking about when people start using cocaine. And that is why they become terrible parents and terrible police officers, and why whiskey doesn't really have that dramatic an effect. I'm totally against whiskey also, but no, the effect on your life of cocaine and how it changes the way you perceive everything else in your life, including your relationship with your husband or wife, your relationship with your kids.
Should I take it as you
yes.
have more personal experience?
Seeing as we're comparing this to the number 0, I have used cocaine infinitely more times than you.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And I did so. This is really in keeping with my character. I did so after I just finished reading a significant tome, a scientific book It wasn't just about the science and chemistry of cocaine and its effects, but it was about the whole history of pseudoscience, of misperceptions and misunderstandings of cocaine, how it was first interpreted as a miracle cure. It went through the whole history of this. There were two related books I read, but that one in particular really impressed me. And I realized there's something here.
Education would be enough to get people to stop using cocaine? Like, you think it's just so amazing that everyone will do it all the time?
No, I didn't say everyone. I'm an example of someone who will never use cocaine again, because I have a philosophy. I have an idea. I will also never watch a football game again. I'm a very unusual person that way, right? But I mean, there's what's worth living in life, and there's what's not worth living. I'll probably also never go downhill skiing. There's all kinds of things I think are meaningless, and I think they're destructive and bad, and they're self-destructive, and they have negative impacts on other people. That's true. But do you want to live in a society where 10% of people, just to pick a number, I think that's a low estimate, are cocaine users, or would you rather live in a country like Japan where an incredibly small, it's not zero, but incredibly small the percentage of people are cocaine users for a variety of reasons, yes, including, enforcement and fear and stigma and all those things. That's absolutely part of it.
I don't buy that, because places like Colombia, for example.
Yeah, but what don't you buy?
Just be specific. What don't you buy? For thousands of years, and they've had cocaine for many years as well. The United States, back when cocaine was available everywhere.
Yes.
When people were sticking it in caffeinated beverages.
Mass addiction was a huge problem.
We did not have super high rates of cocaine addiction.
Oh, we did.
No,
that's quite false. Again, that was covered in that same book I read. The period of cocaine being legal and the consequences for it. The period of heroin being legal in China, leading to the opium wars. There was a period when opium was legal and the British Empire made their money growing opium and so in China, and it became a mass epidemic that destroyed Chinese society. I can quote the official.
I don't think that, but can you? But
does that history not matter? Does the history of what happened when cocaine was legal in America and when it was legal, does that just not matter because it's inconvenient?
Most of it was racist. Most of it was written in order to terrorize people. Yes, most of the people who were writing about this. Most of the people who were writing about this, because I did have to read books and newspaper articles and go through all those articles when I was preparing my research for my master's, I had to read many articles written by people who were saying things like, oh, the black people in our town are going crazy because they've had, cocaine-laced beverages, and that's what they like to drink. Those are the kind of articles.
And you think you can take a hit of cocaine and not go crazy, just a little bit.
Well, for one thing, these things were very small, but you're going to take it all at.
Okay. I'm not taking anything at face value. Look, I remember seeing an official history of China from the Chinese government, in which they said succinctly, and they included the statistic, that more than 1 in 4 adult men were opium users by the time the opium wars. The level of social addiction was amazing. Let me just point out also, let's include a white people example. In England in the 17th century, the rate of alcohol consumption, nobody drank water. Everyone, including children, drank beer 3 meals a day if they didn't drink wine and whiskey in addition to that. You had a whole society of drunks, so nearly, by today's standards, a 100% alcoholism rate, and 17th century history reflects that. Mass addiction is possible, and historically it's actual. It's happened. But I mean, yes, the outbreak of epidemics of addiction to these drugs, epidemic levels of it being a disaster. I think right now it is not as extreme as China time, but it is widely seen that right now the effects of drugs in Mexico are some kind of disaster. Mexico is going through a very tough time. The way I say that with some compassion and not to demonize them.
Not because of massive drug use. Drug trafficking through Mexico is really what's causing that issue, and the violence with interdiction. That's what's causing the problem in Mexico.
Right now with drug addiction, again, I just say this: you don't think it's a problem when a parent neglects their own children because they're drug addicts.
I just said that it
is a problem. Of course, it's a problem. Of course, it's a problem. Yeah, so that's not enforcement. That's the problem. That's the actual drug use. I mean, this is a huge problem for our generation.
But they could be using alcohol. I just think that putting things in the closet and hiding them doesn't really contribute to solving these problems.
Okay, so in what sense can you dismiss my position that way of putting things in the closet and hiding them?
I don't mean to dismiss your position. I just disagree with it. But I think the idea that prohibiting drug use for the population, I don't think that is going to improve the mom that's going to become a drug addict. They do that because of psychological issues. I completely
So
reject the
again,
idea
you
that we have a
switch.
huge number of drug addicts.
So you switch between two positions. Sometimes you claim drug addicts are totally normal people who can hold a job, or it can even be a police officer while using cocaine or heroin 3 times a week.
Oh, well,
and sometimes you claim
I would say
the only reason why people become drug users or drug addicts is because they have deep-seated psychological problems, which would just exhibit themselves anyway in something equally as harmful. I think that's a ridiculous argument. Yeah.
Okay, no. People can be functional and use drugs. So people can be functional.
I don't accept that. But go on. Not with cocaine and heroin. Yeah, I don't.
I disagree. When you are addicted to a substance and need it in order to live, I certainly don't think anyone can do that. Like, certainly, I would assume probably within that example of the cop using it twice a week or something like that, because that was your example. It sounds like that person
multiple times a week,
dependent upon that substance. But so I'm not saying that someone can use that there somehow isn't anything wrong with them just because. Like, obviously there's something wrong if someone is dependent on drugs. I'm not sure what you're arguing.
I think it's very clear, but anyway, the great thing about YouTube is you can go back and watch it again. In northern Laos, where I did humanitarian work and a lot of research and so on, and China over a longer period of time is another example. When I was up there, of course, some of my research was in a library, but some was actually out in those villages. There was a lot of cynicism from left-wing people that what the Lao government was doing at that time in eliminating opium use was pointless, because they said what you've said it now, and you said it in email in different contexts, that somehow if you eliminate heroin use, opium use, etc., that some other drug will replace it that's just as bad. I think that's a totally false argument, and I don't think you believe it yourself. If your daughter quit cocaine and started drinking beer, it's not the same. That's just nonsense. And I just want just to finish the issue with Laos. I saw for myself, and other people saw. I remember one guy admitted he was wrong. He didn't, he wasn't happy to admit he was wrong. But there was a village that had a long history with opium. Heroin is a reformed form. Heroin is a reformed. Pardon me. Heroin is a refined form of opium. But they're in some ways the same drug, in some ways not. They had this long history of it. And guess what? When in that village, opium was replaced with alcohol and cigarettes, life got better for everybody. Yes, people drank alcohol instead of used heroin. You think that's not a difference? You think it's not a difference for your daughter as one individual and her life and her career? You think it's not a difference for a social unit like a village or a nation on a whole? It's an unbelievable difference. It transforms the whole society. You think there's not a difference between having a park with a bunch of literal crackheads, whether it's cocaine or heroin, staggering around the park? You think there's not a difference between that and a society like Scotland? When I lived in Scotland, there were a lot of drunks staggering around Scotland. It's different. It's a difference worth appreciating. It's a difference worth fighting for.
Scotland does have a huge issue with opium use. I'm not sure.
It does too, yes. But my point is here, there's a tremendous difference between beer and opium, or beer and cocaine, that everyone else is willing to admit except you. And again, you say you've never used any of these drugs. Maybe that makes it worse. I know what effects whiskey have on me. I know what effects cocaine have on me. And I know that other people have even less ability to cope with those effects than I do. No, there's a tremendous fundamental difference. Now, that's true on the scale of the individual, whether it's your daughter or it's a complete stranger. Whether it's your employee or your employer. Having a boss that's using cocaine 3 times a week, your life is hell. You don't want to have a boss who uses cocaine 3 times a week, and it's not your choice. You can't discipline him. The government can. The government can arrest him. What if it's the owner of Microsoft? What if it's your boss? What if that's the relationship authority? And then what if it's your employee? That's a tough spot too. Okay, so I'm the manager on a construction site. What am I supposed to do? Beat up my own employee? I can't. That's a role for the police. It's a role for the government. I think actually deep down inside you feel that way. You don't really want the employer taking on that role. But whether it's one person, your daughter, an employee, or your boss, that's one thing. You scale it up onto the village level. You talk about a village in Laos where all the people with money and power and guns are opium lords, are opium dealers. As opposed to a village where the people, and I'm not comparing it to paradise, a village where the people with money and power are people who own a bar that sells alcohol and quite possibly a brothel that sells prostitutes. I'm not saying they went from being an opium den town to being paradise. They went from being an opium den town to a place.
The difference between those two things is the fact that one is worse than the other. I would say that it's the fact that one is illegal and the other is not.
No, I think you missed my point. I mean, in the period where opium was used openly, it was de facto legal. There was, in effect, no authority governing it. And in some villages in Laos, the authorities actually encouraged it and taxed it, which is kind of a bit of an open secret. So they had a period where it was de facto legal. They also had a period where the whole country had no written law whatsoever, so it was neither legal nor illegal, and local authorities allowed it. So there really is a contrast between it being licit and it actually being stamped out and illicit. Life changes profoundly. I'm also against drinking whiskey, but again, I think you're lying to yourself and you're lying to others if you pretend that's not a difference. Whether it's your own daughter drinking, if she starts drinking whiskey 3 times a week, that is one thing. If she starts using cocaine or heroin 3 times a week, that is something completely profoundly different. And you scale it up, and that village in Laos having sober police officers enforcing the law there, as opposed to, and this is a huge problem in Afghanistan, authority figures who are themselves dopeheads, who are themselves using heroin.
How many police officers, like the challenge I have with some of this stuff, like when you talk about the cocaine, even the example of the police officer who does cocaine a few times a week, we still get that today, but instead of them being able to openly seek help and everything like that, they would be fired immediately. They would lose their job. Like there's no, it's very, very difficult to address those problems when you have prohibition. I don't think the price is worth the cost. I don't think that it makes the world a much better place. And you said yourself that you don't think that drug use would increase that dramatically if it were legal. So that's your own words. You said that you didn't think it would be a dramatic increase.
I think it would be significant, but it won't be dramatic. I'm not indulging in the sort of hysterical view that it's going to grow absolutely exponentially. And there are examples from Europe and so on that show a modest increase, but not society collapsing and everyone becoming. I say that also with speed limits. If you get rid of speed limits, many people will still grow.
I'm not going to go out and do it. I don't think most people are going to go out and do it. Maybe a few people will try it. Maybe some of them will become addicted. But it will be easier to help treat them and everything like that. And so my fundamental position hasn't really changed. Like, it's just, that's...
Well, I think okay.
I'm just not sure.
I think position is one thing. I think the objective you're pursuing is something worth stating. Maybe that'll wrap up this discussion. In the past, in email, I think you misrepresented or misunderstood or both my position by saying to me you wrote at one point, making these drugs illegal is not going to solve the underlying problems of poverty and racism and other terrible things. And my response to this, look, I feel that's really dishonest. I'm not talking about solving poverty. Solving poverty in Japan is a separate issue. Solving poverty in Laos is a different issue. Alleviating poverty in Canada is different. We can talk about that. Or alleviating racism. I'm not talking about underlying issues. I'm talking about this issue. It's true also, but just to give parallel, if we speed limits do not solve the underlying causes for why people drive their cars too fast. There are underlying causes, which could be addressed by building a better train system, public transport, making rent cheaper so people can live closer to their place of employment so they don't have to drive for 45 minutes to get to work. There are underlying reasons. But if we believe speed limits are a good thing, we believe it's a good thing in itself. And I'm actually advocating for drugs being illegal as a good thing in itself. It's getting across that sincerity, I think, was step one.
I know you do. I don't doubt your sincerity at all. And what I hope is clear for me is that I'm not sure, when it comes to the issues about, should police officers be doing cocaine a couple times a week, I'm willing to change my mind about things. This is not a position I have set in stone. And certainly with all of those things that we were discussing, when you're bringing up those really extreme...
When you run for mayor, I'm going to quote you on that. The newspapers are going to say, ModVegan is running for mayor, but she says police officers she can use cocaine 3 times a week.
What I do is I change my mind in response to evidence, and that's why I'm slow to form opinions even about police officers doing drugs.
Right.
I want to think about it before I make that decision. I know you can make that decision much more quickly than I can. I will not deny that. You're much quicker to make decisions about things than I am.
Well, no, I have years behind this. I mean, it's not something that comes too quickly.
It's not something that I don't tend to think about police officers doing cocaine all day. Although
it's a big issue. It is a huge issue in our society. It is.
Obviously, as a society, we have to deal with it. One thing I do want to talk about very briefly is that I live right next to probably one of the largest concentrations of homeless in my city. Yeah. And I know these people. I talk to them on a regular basis. And when you talk to them, the number one problem for all of them, especially the older ones, like I guess maybe it's because they're still alive, but they're all deeply addicted to alcohol.
Right.
And it causes all sorts of problems for them. And I think, there's the people that are addicted to drugs, there's the people that are addicted to alcohol. A lot of them will do any substance that crosses their path. They'll just do anything. Most of them will. Like, they prefer alcohol, but if something comes their way, they'll do that. And it's just, it seems really clear to me that the kind of problem that you were talking about, if we return this to the problem that you were discussing, in Vancouver, maybe you do see more people who are addicted to heroin and things like that. But I still remember my grandfather in Texas telling me the same thing when he was growing up in East Texas, like in extremely rural poverty. Those people obviously didn't have drugs, but almost every single person he knew died of alcoholism. Like he just saw it all the time. He would tell me stories of seeing people, and it was so interesting because he was always saying, like, you'd see them shaking in the street from alcohol, and it was horrifying to him. He never drank. He just found it completely off-putting, and I get it. I went to Vancouver. You think I would ever try heroin after seeing some of the stuff I saw there? Like, no way. But I don't think that it's necessarily the legality of the substance. Alcohol ruins people's lives.
Okay.
Alcohol makes people abusive. It does all sorts of things, but I think it's because there's underlying issues there.
Right.
That these people that I'm seeing all the time, they're not going to get cured or made worse by the situation.
Well,
like, it's just...
I think, though, if there's 2 points you could take from this, I think you've got to drop the underlying issues thing. Because in the same way, I think it's not kind of fair or helpful to say about speed limits, well, speed limits aren't going to solve the underlying issues. I don't think it's fair to say this. And the second thing is to drop this argument based on false equivalence. Because, as I say, it's not the same on one scale if your daughter's doing cocaine 3 times a week or if she's drinking alcohol 3 times a week. It's not the same. There is no equivalence. And many of your arguments rely on saying to me that if people do not use these illegal drugs, if they don't use cocaine and heroin, then they'll just use something else like alcohol or glue huffing anyway.
Can we take the couple times a week? Unfortunately for me, I find that a bit confusing. If we could make it someone who is addicted to cocaine and someone who is addicted to alcohol.
No, because
if you talk, if you make
I'm talking about all use, though. I really am.
So,
but
all use
right.
is harder. But if you can go with a police officer who is addicted to alcohol or a police officer who is addicted to cocaine, because that's a real thing. Alcoholism.
Yes.
When you get shakes. I was at a doctor's office.
Right.
To speak with someone who in a suit who smelled so strongly of alcohol, I felt like I was going to be sick.
Right.
It was 9 in the morning. So addiction. So if we're talking about addiction, then I can very clearly state that the societal harms for both are equal. If we're talking about addiction.
Okay. So I don't think you truly believe that, and I can demonstrate it at both ends of the scale. I mean, this is to me like Socrates. I think you're making an argument that you do not believe yourself. So the 3 very rapid points. They're rapid because we already discussed stuff. 1, you know that alcohol causes some brain damage. It causes some. I've made arguments on this channel that people should quit drinking alcohol because of brain damage. Well, just let me finish this. Alcohol causes some brain damage.
Mm-hmm.
Cocaine causes more brain damage. I mean, you know this medically.
No, occasional use.
I've seen MRI scan data. I mean, it's pretty awful.
Well, if you look
what
at
cocaine
an
does
addict,
to you.
we're going to just compare addicts for now. If you
No,
don't mind,
but
that's okay.
I'm interested in all use.
Well,
Okay.
I
But
can't say how
that's
much
only one
I
element.
would
But
assume
it's not the
one
same.
drink.
I mean,
would assume one drink
but
is-
look, it doesn't even matter if cocaine. Huffing glue. So huffing glue, which in some countries, maybe if legal or two, alcohol causes some brain damage. Huffing glue causes more brain damage. Right? It's not the same. And you can have an intervention, whether it's with your own... No, but any level of glue huffing causes brain damage. And it causes a lot more than drinking beer or drinking whiskey. You know this.
And that's what
So
people can do
it is fundamentally false to treat these as equivalent or to say in a resigned way, well, if people aren't huffing glue, they're just going to drink alcohol. And as you just claimed, so the societal damage is the same. Of course it's not the same. Of course it's different.
I think when we look at the issue of addiction, they are all relatively the same. Like if you look at an addiction,
I will just say, I think even if you had just tried huffing glue, using cocaine, using heroin, you, even on that one level of one person, you would not claim for an instant that it's the same. That's my honest opinion. You can meet people. I think you can ask those same homeless people, and if they have done all of these drugs, I think they will agree with me. No, it's really not the same. Really, it's not the same in many ways.
In many ways, not the same place, no matter what the initial substance is.
So again, I would say with my own daughter, it's completely different if it's alcohol versus cocaine. Whether or not you feel it is fine. But then when you scale it up, when you look at a heavy drinking society like Canada or Russia or Scotland, I've lived in both Canada and Scotland. I haven't lived in Russia. If you were to, on that scale, if you replaced alcohol with cocaine, you don't think there would be a tremendous transformation of the whole society? You actually think the social damage, if as the default drug people are using, both using and abusing at all levels, whether using occasionally or using heavily, if you removed alcohol and you made cocaine available and it was used at the same levels.
So that's a ridiculous argument, Isel. I'm not asking people to replace alcohol with heroin, so that's not what I'm arguing.
No, but Maud, you don't see logically that this is very much directly selling. You made the claim that the social impact is the same. It's not the same. You're admitting, if you can recognize that.
A single use. So you're saying that an ounce of...
All use. If you look at China in the era of the Opium Wars, when opium was the main drug used by everyone, when opium was in that society like beer. And again, in northern Laos, just a few decades ago, we had societies like that. It is worse. Being in a village in Laos where heroin is commonly used, it is not... The social impact is not the same as being in a town full of drunks. It's not. Heroin really is different from alcohol.
No, but I don't have to believe that in order to think that drugs should be legalized. I don't have to believe
but that is your argument. So, I mean, can you not recognize that you've just conceded the argument without saying it? Your argument was that the social impact is the same for alcohol and for these other drugs, and that therefore you can make this argument for equivalence. And I've just challenged that, and I think you are conceding, without wanting to admit that you're conceding it, in fact, they're not equivalent. They are profoundly different on the level of the individual and the level of a society as a whole, whether it's one village or one country.
I think that's neither here nor there, according to my argument. I'm not saying that.
Your argument was built on these claims. Your argument was built on these claims, and now you're saying it, that there really is a difference. That there really is a difference.
4% of the U.S. population a year. It's pretty dangerous.
Yes, but the point is that the harm to society and the harm to individual people would not be the same if instead you lived in China in the era of the Opium Wars. If you lived in a society where it was opium that was commonly used,
you're requiring that I assume that people use those substances at just as great a rate as China during the Opium Wars. Like, that's a huge assumption.
It's a real historical example rather than a hypothetical one.
It may be a real historical example, but that is one time in one place, and you're asking me to extrapolate.
What am I asking you? What am I asking you? So I'm not asking that.
You said that it'll be China during the Opium
No,
Wars.
I'm not. No, I'm not. That's not the question.
Okay.
The question.
Look at Geneva. It's not that everyone there.
The question, right? Everyone there is still drinking alcohol. Alcohol is still the socially dominant drug. That's right. That's right.
People know that if you have a drink, we are more used to it. It's more socially acceptable. And people, once it's legalized, we don't all run out and do heroin.
Your argument, I was saying, is based on a false equivalence that you stated in many ways, including the statement, if people don't have access to these illegal drugs, if the government doesn't make them legal at high quality, the government making high-quality cocaine and heroin illegal, which is what Milton Friedman wanted, letting people kill themselves, letting people overdose. If the government doesn't do that, it doesn't matter because you argued the social impact of drugs is equivalent. It will be the same if they can't use that drug and they instead use alcohol. And that is completely false.
Can I make this more clear? And hopefully we can agree that this is not I'm not going back on my opinion or anything here. Addiction rates will be the same. Like the number of people, and I told you already that I believe that alcohol addiction is just as harmful as heroin addiction.
Okay. I know, but that's exactly what I'm saying. To say alcohol is just as harmful as cocaine is ridiculous.
Addiction.
No.
Alcohol.
Brain. Okay, so I've already mentioned several. 1, brain damage. 2, the effects on an individual. 3, the effects on society as a whole in aggregate. Those are the 3 grounds I pointed out to you. They're all different. There is no equivalent.
I'm saying levels of addiction are not going to change. Addiction is just as harmful regardless, and therefore the overall harm of one is not greater than the other.
So, but you conceded all three grounds. But the brain damage isn't the same. You know this.
For addiction,
you conceded this, right?
You keep trying to make it
for
like
any.
you.
Well, it's true of addiction also, but you concede the point either way. I mean, you concede that brain damage is not the same. Mm-hmm. You concede that the effects on the individual, whether it's your daughter or a policeman or a parent or your boss or your employee, is not the same. And you admit that the effects on society are not the same.
Well,
so you have completely conceded your argument.
No.
You're just refusing to admit that you have.
Eisel, the thing is that the same number of people are going to become addicted either way, because it is a health issue, it's a mental wellness issue. It is not just a...
You've already conceded that's not true, but maybe 30 minutes ago, that no, it's not the case that only people with mental health problems use cocaine. Completely sane, hardworking people use cocaine.
Over and over again. It's a different kind of mental health issue, but it's still a mental health issue. Someone who wants to feel the way you were describing.
Look, this is like the no true Scotsman. This is like the no true Scotsman fallacy. Like what? Only people with some kind of deep mental problem become drug addicts? That's ridiculous. You and I know normal people who become drug addicts.
Become drug addicts?
Sure.
Yes.
Anyone can become a drug addict.
Absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, I know people who became a drug addict because they were in the hospital and they were put on prescription meds. Like they had literally no choice. They were strapped down to a hospital bed and they become addicted through exposure to completely normal people.
Addicted.
Yes, they do. You can become addicted that way. I've known people it's happened to. Sure.
Well, you can become dependent. You can become dependent, but only if you're
and then they have to
that's
quit.
A physician issue and things like that. But if people experience a drug
the point is,
once, they're not going to become addicted.
No, they're in the hospital for a long time. That's the point. They're strapped down in a hospital bed getting drugs all the time. And then when they leave, they have to struggle to quit the drug. People get addicted to drugs in all kinds of circumstances. No, it's ridiculous for you to say on the one hand simultaneously that perfectly normal, rational people can still hold down a job while using cocaine 3 times a week, and therefore it should be a civil right and should be legalized. And you claim then whenever it's convenient for you that no, it's not possible for the social impacts of cocaine to be worse because if they weren't using cocaine, they'd be using alcohol, and that's the same. Like living in a society where, like whatever percentage it is, living in a society where 2% of people are alcoholics, or it could be 10%, but let's say it's 2%, you don't see that as different from living in a society where 2% of people are cocaine addicts, or 2% of people are heroin addicts. It's a completely false argument. The social impacts are different, the brain damage is different, the health impacts are different, and the effects on the individual are very different in their life. They're very different. Why would they be the same?
I do disagree with you because the stats bear it out in terms of death statistics and brain damage and everything else. If 2% of the population are heroin addicts or 2% of the population are alcohol addicts, yes, the social impact is the same.
Well, I'm sorry. So in what sense, given all the things you've conceded, again, it could be glue huffing. Why not concede glue huffing really is different from drinking whiskey? And cocaine really is different from whiskey. Why?
The
only thing is you're claiming false equivalence, so you can justify.
The occasional use of all those substances does vary in terms of its danger, and we know that it varies somewhat in terms of its addictive potential. But the number of addicts tends to remain overall the same around the world. That's just a fact that we keep pointing out over
so
and
it's
over
not the case that there are dramatically fewer drug addicts in China today than in the era of the Opium War. It remains the same. It's not the case. You've even argued that harm reduction. You've argued that harm reduction and legalization leads to there being fewer addicts. So I don't know an example of that, but you must have an example of a country where the number of addicts dramatically declined. Isn't that possible?
Well, they found that
Isn't it possible that the number of addicts can dramatically increase and dramatically decline, and that we have myriad real historical examples of that correlate to different drug policies? I'm sorry, Mod. Your argument is profoundly nonsensical. And I hope you watch this video later and see that. I can't keep repeating myself. But you are actually... This is profoundly logically flawed. I don't want to ask yourself and force you to admit this. But you admit the brain damage is not the same. And then you want to turn around and say, no, it's the same. You admit the social impacts are not the same. And then you want to say, no, it's the same. And your reasoning here is that allegedly the percentage of people who are addicts doesn't change. But that's not the only issue. Even if I conceded that point, you would still be wrong. Even if the percentage of people who are addicts were the same in 19th century China and 21st century China, which is a complete lie, there's a dramatic change in that society in the number of people using opium, still, even if the percentage of people is the same, the point is the effects, including brain damage, including the effects on what kind of parent you are, or what type of police officer you are, or what type of pilot you are profoundly different. Being in a society that normalizes and accepts cocaine use as opposed to one that
not
stigmatizes it,
normalizing
is
it,
opposed to
that's
it, and throws people in prison for it, really is different. And you can see that again, where I was in Laos with heroin, you could see it in the same village in two different periods of history that are close together. Life really changed for people in those villages. And as I say, when I was in Perpignan, so it's a different issue. I don't think of this as a rich people's issue. Being a poor person and being
I can't say, unfortunately, I wish I could relate to all of these examples. I completely accept your examples of Laos and things like that. That's fine. With the opium wars, from what I've understood, it seems like it's very difficult to get exact numbers as to the number of the people that were addicted and things like that. I can say that in Colombia, at the same time that, the drug use has increased, and we're not talking addiction necessarily, but use, while it's increased, crime has dropped dramatically. And that's because...
Yes, but also poverty has dropped dramatically. I mean, a lot of things have changed. Poverty has dropped dramatically.
Yeah.
I mean, the Civil War has ended.
Poverty has anything to do with addiction rates and things like that? You don't think it's mental illness,
I'm sorry,
poverty,
but look, but do you think? I mean, I've tried to be respectful, although trenchant is argument. Sorry, but do you think that's actually a reasonable question? You just asked me. Don't you think poverty is related to drug use? I mean, what's the point of your question?
No. I think that, like we see in Colombia, sometimes when people have more money, they do produce. But with the crime, maybe I misunderstood you. When I was talking about the crime,
right? The
crime issue was because most of the cultivation was happening in that country. Now that it's moved out of the country, I mean, this is somewhat unrelated, but the war, it's basically moved to Mexico.
So your point was, which is a reasonable point, that drug use has increased while crime has decreased. And I said, yes, poverty has also decreased. Poverty has improved. So that's consistent with exactly that. So, I mean, it's not like you're going to undermine my argument by saying, don't you believe poverty is linked to this issue? The
drug use doesn't necessarily lead, as you've been saying, like the use of drugs, the legalization of drugs does not lead inexorably to higher crime. It doesn't lead inexorably to terrible parents. It doesn't lead inexorably to all these things. Like, as long as you're in a society where they're attempting to address these issues, where they're educating people, this is not, China in the Middle Ages. Like, we're trying to educate people, we're trying to inform them about things. I don't think that it's fair to use historical examples like that. When we're making inroads, we're trying to help understand people and help them with their issues. I think it's a very different situation, and I don't think that criminalization helps anyone. It kicks the can down the road. It forces violence and crime in places that are outside of our vision. That isn't really solving the world's problems.
Okay, I disagree. I think criminalization helps everyone. So I'm at the opposite extreme on that.
Why does criminalization help?
Just on my own bias, I'm also totally against alcohol. Like, I think everyone should quit drinking alcohol. That's what I think. However, if you ask me, can you be a good cop and drink alcohol 3 times a week? The answer is yes. Can you be a good parent and drink alcohol 3 times a week? The answer is yes. I have to concede that. I think you would be an even better cop or a better parent if you quit drinking alcohol. That's my opinion, but I have to concede that. I do not believe you can be a good police officer while using cocaine 3 times a week. I do not believe you can be a good parent, or at least maybe for 1 week you can. Maybe for 1 week if you do that. But over any length of time, over 10 years, a parent using cocaine 3 times a week. And I don't know why you like cocaine so much. You never tried it. You should try it. It'll change your whole perspective on this issue. I think you would concede. How can you be a good parent while huffing glue 3 times a week? There is no equivalence. These things are legislated unequally because they really are unequal.
You're saying that because legalization may increase the use of drugs, you believe your argument is legalization might increase the use of drugs?
No, my argument isn't that complex at all. It doesn't rely on any difference. That's why I'm saying it doesn't rely on any of these expostulations. Some substances cause more brain damage than others. Same with industrial pollution, same with a workplace regulation, same with health and safety, same with ecology and everything else.
But why does that mean
your perspective relies on the assumption any recreational drug is equal to all, so either they all have to be legal or they all have to be illegal, and you make arguments on that basis. From my perspective, there is
That's your argument, that they all need to be...
I attributed that to you. I said you are arguing from a false equivalence here, that the damage to society and the damage to people is the same or approximately the same for cocaine, heroin, huffing glue, and drinking alcohol. And I'm saying, no, it is different. And
No,
that's why we can and should legislate
I
different
think
types
that
of
the
substances
damage
different ways.
of prohibition of those things is approximately the same to having them be legal, and that the damage to our personal and civil liberties is greater, and therefore they should be legal.
Do the people of Japan lack civil liberties right now?
They lack the ability to be able to use, marijuana without having,
Correct.
without going to prison.
Correct.
They have a big yakuza controlling their drug supply. Canadians make a whole lot of money selling drugs to Japan, and that's one way that a lot of people make a living. I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing. Like, they have a criminal.
So that's terrible that people in Japan lack access to high quality, cheap, legal cocaine. That's having really negative effects in their society. You think?
Cocaine or marijuana or anything else. Like, if you're going to do the same with me,
that's
example.
Japan. We're talking about a real world example. So people in Japan, it's very hard for them and very risky for them to use cocaine. And you think that's a bad thing, in contrast to Colombia, where it's legal and readily available.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's that legally and readily available.
Personal use of cocaine is legal in Colombia. That's the law. It's a very liberal law.
Yes, but it's not like everyone's just doing it on the street everywhere. But
okay, if we go to a nightclub in Medellin, you think it's hard to get cocaine now?
Probably
it's
not.
easy and it's overt. It's overt, and there's no shame and stigma. They don't have to hide anymore. You don't have to hide it.
Well, that's not true. That is completely untrue, Michael. I have been to Colombia recently since this has happened, and no,
you didn't go to a nightclub where people were using cocaine openly.
No, I've been to nightclubs. They do not
where people use cocaine openly. Well, you're going to the wrong nightclubs. You realize this isn't something I have to dig deep to get a footnote to prove. There are nightclubs in Medellin where people are openly using cocaine, and they do so because they're not afraid of being put in prison for using it.
That's not true. That's an assumption of yours, but no.
What do you say? This is incredibly well documented. I didn't say all nightclubs. There are nightclubs. Perhaps
our definition of open is different, but no, people don't just stand out in the front entrance of a nightclub and do cocaine. That is not what they do. Sorry, that's not how it works. Yeah, I
think they do it on a table inside the nightclub, and they do it partly to look cool and partly to attract the interest of women.
Believe it or not, it still has a lot of negative stigma. So in terms of our earlier conversation with the
so nobody in Medellin. I'd have to look really hard. I mean, again, I've already looked at articles before this conversation. Nobody in nightclubs in Medellin is doing cocaine. This is what you're arguing.
No, I'm not. I'm saying that they no.
Yeah.
I said that they don't. It's not something that people are proud of and do at the very front entrance to show off. That's very unless.
So let me ask this honestly. Let me say something. You don't think there are people who show off doing cocaine in the United States of America right now on Instagram?
Oh yeah, I'm sure there are.
You don't think there are people who show off using cocaine in nightclubs in Los Angeles because it's cool, because it attracts, because people do it in Medellin also. We're all human.
And it's legal there, and you're trying to argue that. What I'm saying is that it doesn't increase the amount of people doing it publicly. That was your whole argument in the beginning. It is illegal in the United States. It is prohibited. They can go to prison.
And they boast about doing it anyway.
They will do it on Instagram. They're still doing it anyway, and they're not doing it much more visibly in Colombia. The level of the visibility of it is not that much greater. No, it's not. Try going there. I don't understand why. So that's your argument. Your entire argument is that they do it in the U.S.
Why don't you? Okay, look, why don't you?
It's illegal. If you're talking about your whole argument has been based on this idea that that the shame is good, that the criminalization is good, like you said, like arrest, it's good. But is it really that good if people are still doing it publicly? It is not legal in the United States. People are still doing it publicly, as you said. That is your argument, not mine.
Okay, so you really think that is my argument? Because I mean, I can repeat my argument, but
you're just stated right there that in spite of a massive drug war, people still do drugs in the United States, despite everything else. Like, I just don't,
How does that contradict in any way what I've been saying? So, I mean,
It shows that it is not terribly effective, is what it shows.
Okay, so you think drug policy in Japan is not effective?
It might be effective in Japan. There's other places that have very draconian drug laws, like the United States, where it is not effective. Right. So it shows that countries are different.
Yes, I'm aware of this. I mean, this is my argument is not based on denial of reality, whereas yours is. You were arguing that nobody in a nightclub in Medellin is openly and boastfully using cocaine.
No,
and I countered that by pointing out to you that right now in the United States, pardon me, this is why I mentioned people using cocaine in Los Angeles. People right now in the United States are openly and boastfully using cocaine, even on Instagram, even in nightclubs. And they do it partly because it's cool. You seem to ignore these factors. What, sorry?
Are they doing it in Japan?
A very, very small number of people, but drug use, especially hard drug use like this, it's fractional to an unbelievable extent. They have an incredibly low rate of drug use there.
And why is that?
It is indeed partly because they have a very robust culture of both legislation and shame, enforcement and shame. There are real consequences.
You don't think that there's shame in the United States around drug use? You don't think that there is enforcement around drug use in the United States? If you go to
let me ask you the opposite. Let me ask you that. It's a very good question, but you're asking it with a presumed Do you not think there is a culture of celebrating drug use in the States? Do you not think today I've heard maybe 10 rap songs celebrating drug use as something cool and edgy? You don't think so? I listen to real rap music. I listen to 50 Cent and Lil Wayne, and they brag about cocaine and how it helps you get laid with women and how it makes you the cool guy at the nightclub. And I think you're dreaming if you think those same factors don't exist in Medellin or in all over the world. Basically, those same pushes and pulls.
And Osaka, most likely as well.
Indeed, but at a much lower rate. Japan is a very successful example of drug policy.
Pardon? No. Excuse me, though. You were just saying that it's this glamorization of drug use. So they don't ever. I mean, I don't know because I'm not.
You asked the question: does America have a culture of shame with drug use? That is partly true, yes, but it's also true that America has a culture of glamorizing drug use.
And wouldn't you say that in Osaka they do exactly the same? There are people who glamorize drug use.
We both know it's tremendously different because in Japan they've been much more successful. But indeed, if you listen to Japanese,
if you listen to Japanese rap music,
you're going to find it. But it is indeed, but it's version different. Sorry, so do you actually think there's no difference between Mexico, Colombia, Los Angeles, and Japan? There's a profound difference. We both know. We've shared the statistics by email before this conversation.
I don't really. I'm kind of baffled because when we go back to I'm a little bit baffled because if we're trying to compare all these different countries, they have different policies. Every single one of the nations that you've mentioned. Colombia is only now starting. They had very draconian.
1994, they legalized cocaine.
And you know why? It's because they were spending all of their time going
after. It was a Supreme Court decision.
Yeah, but it was they had very harsh drug laws for a very long time, and they didn't work.
Right.
So and you've got the same with if we look at Islamic countries that have
absolutely
horrific.
Your argument is that the level of drug addicts will be the same anyway. That's what you argued. Although all of these historical examples, including the ones you choose, prove that you're wrong. The number of drug addicts can vary dramatically from one period of history to another in China, and from one period of history to another in Laos, or in comparing Los Angeles to Osaka, Japan, or whatever, or Tokyo, Japan.
Yeah,
of course.
I think legalization can help with crime levels and things like that, obviously, because you have people using cleaner drugs, safer drugs.
Right,
I think that levels.
But what it doesn't help with is the brain damage, does it?
Of the single use of a drug.
You're getting this is the implicit fallacy of talking about underlying problems as opposed to the problem. I don't want to talk about the side effects of drugs, like you use cocaine. But that's implicitly I can't.
In terms of moving the goalpost, you like moving goalposts as much as I do.
How's moving the goalpost? Like we're talking about we're talking about cocaine and we're talking about heroin. But if you want to talk about crimes committed by cocaine addicts, that's different. What your position is like Milton Friedman. You want to say, just let them kill themselves. I think that is evil. I think that is evil. Well, you said less. I think, and it is not to prevent them from committing other crimes. I've never once said that. I've never once said in this argument. You're attributing that to me in passing. I've never once said we should arrest cocaine addicts to stop them from committing theft. I have said, my objective here, this was actually what I was going to ask in the closing question, is what is the actual objective you want for society? I want to live in a society of predominantly sober people with very low rates of drug use. I don't think it's attainable to have zero, so that's why I don't say zero. Japan in 2018, which has astoundingly low crime rates, and they're still getting lower, amazingly, unlike Colombia, unlike Mexico, unlike Los Angeles. It's a very successful society in that way. Enforcement is only...
Crime rates are much lower, but
They're lower than Japan?
No, than they used to be. Like we have to... obviously the height of the drug war in the 80s, it's different.
Right, but the crime rate in Colombia is not preferable to Japan. You know the level of human safety.
No, again, if we're acknowledging that different countries have different histories, we have to acknowledge that we need to base it on, what it was 10 years ago versus what it is today.
So right now,
in the same country.
like, do you think you're derailing the argument or not? I mean, like,
No, but I think that this all comes down to the very thing that we said in the very beginning. You feel like you were talking about, like, a society of love and everything like that. Like, that's what you want. You want a society of sober people. I'd like that. I think it's unrealistic, and I think that making drugs illegal causes untold harm. So that's the difference, because harm is what matters to me, and so I think that's just coming back to the same thing.
But
I don't know why we can't just agree.
No, but this is why. So you just asked, well, aren't you moving the goalposts? And I said, no, I'm not. I'm just talking about the direct brain damage and the direct damage to people's lives caused by cocaine. You can't claim that there's less harm because cocaine itself causes harm. I think you're the one using it in this argument.
That's why harm for what?
In terms of the harm on your brain, on your person, and on society, the 3 levels I've already talked about. You can't argue that for huffing glue either. So you're claiming but hold on, please let me actually respond to you. You brought in the issue of crimes committed by people who are cocaine addicts or cocaine users, what have you. And I've said, I'm talking about them actually using cocaine, not whether or not they commit crimes to buy cocaine. Because I actually care, as with my own daughter, I care that you're wasting your life, ruining your life, causing yourself brain damage. And there are, of course, other negative impacts on society. That society as a whole, whether it's the village or the town or the city, it is worse off if 10% of people are opium junkies or heroin junkies or cokeheads or crackheads. Society is worse when 10% of people are addicted to our drugs. I also don't think you dispute that has negative impacts on society. Having 10% of society people being alcoholics is also problematic, but it is not as bad. And I've probably lived in several societies where 10% of people are alcoholics. I mean, probably Scotland and Canada both, whatever. You can certainly be in places where that exists today, and historically there have been examples of people. But you use the term harm, and this is not theoretical.
Yeah.
You think you're reducing harm by allowing more people to use more cocaine at higher quality and to not have to commit crimes to get it. No, more people will be harmed by you providing them cocaine. You'd say this to a drug dealer too. If you met a drug dealer, you might say to him, I understand you're making a lot of money selling cocaine, but the sad thing is you're harming people. When the government becomes the drug dealer, they also are harming people. They're providing people with cocaine, which causes brain damage. Just like if I teach someone to huff glue and I provide them with glue, huffing glue causes brain damage. It's true alcohol also causes brain damage, but it is much less.
Well, there is...
So harm. Your argument is supposed to be based on harm. But what about the harm to the drug users themselves? There's society as a whole also, but this is the harm to real people.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like it's completely pointless. I mean, I think that the evidence that I have found, based on study from all the research that we have regarding addiction and drug use, that if drugs were legalized, it would not appreciably increase the number of addicts, and it would make them safer. It would make society safer. That's all I think about that. I mean, it's very simple.
But so if more people use more cocaine at higher quality...
We don't know if they will.
Sorry.
Again,
okay. All right. So look. So Maud, I'm still right, even if I can see that point. If that's exactly what I'm going to say. If the exact same number of people consume more cocaine at lower prices... You're
assuming that they'll consume more. That is a huge assumption. There's no evidence for that.
You already conceded these points earlier. You already conceded...
No, I did not. They may.
You already conceded the point earlier that if cocaine is completely legal, then more people will try and use... Okay, you did actually say it. We did talk about it.
I disagree. But, I mean, we're talking very small percentages here, maybe one way or the other. I do disagree. Yeah. Okay,
so all right. So your argument is exactly the same number of people using cocaine as their civil right, but now you can't fire them as a police officer using cocaine 3 times a week. You can't intervene and take their kid away from them because they're a parent. Yes, if it's legal, if cocaine is legal.
No, if cocaine is legal, there will be laws for different people depending on their profession.
You want to have it both ways. So you're going to have all the benefits of cocaine being illegal, that police aren't allowed to use it and parents aren't allowed to use it. So parents and police and construction workers, none of them can use cocaine. Only the people who don't matter, only those people get to use cocaine.
They don't matter. They don't. It doesn't matter if they're not going to harm other people to the same extent by using it. Yeah.
How about?
And I know you want these
university professors?
But there are.
Everyone harms people. Everyone has responsibilities. Everyone has the potential to lead a meaningful life or a meaningless life. And I love all mankind, and I don't want to callously cut them off and say, if all you people kill yourselves, that's no problem to me. It's a problem. They're the poor in Canada. Are they not our poor?
Again, I disagree.
The drug addicts, are they not our drug addicts? Whose are they?
I'm not saying we shouldn't help people, but I think that your fundamental argument that it's harming people and that we all harm people when we do things. I mean, I just find it's a utopian argument.
No, it's not. No, Japan isn't utopia. But tell me something. Cocaine causing brain damage. Is that or is that not harm?
I think
That was why I never got to finish my sentence. But I was going to say, if I concede to you exactly the same number of people using exactly the same amount of cocaine, which is ridiculous, but they're getting it legally instead of illegally. If magically but let me say, but if magically that happens, there is still harm being done precisely because cocaine causes brain damage. Precisely because cocaine.
Someone to take it, then it's a different. It's not harm if you're doing it to yourself.
So huffing glue doesn't cause harm. You wouldn't say that.
It does cause harm to you, but that's your decision.
Yes. So, in the same sense, using cocaine doesn't cause harm. It causes harm.
If it's your decision,
no. It is your decision. It is your decision. That's very interesting. But that is harm. That's what we're talking about. You're claiming there is no harm. You wouldn't say that about yourself. You wouldn't say that you huffing glue or using cocaine causes no harm. You wouldn't say it about your daughter. You wouldn't say it about a police officer or a pilot or a parent. You only say it about those people, that it's not doing any harm for them to cause brain damage by using cocaine.
I think it's much clearer now to me. So even though this has been a really, really long conversation.
Yeah.
I think hopefully it's much clearer now. We should have started off from this in the beginning. There was a lot of talking, but I think you made it super, super clear about in the issue of harm, in the issue of brain damage and all those things. If you're making that decision for yourself, then you have that autonomy over yourself and your own agency.
It is harm, right? You are. Why not just concede the point? Brain damage is harm. There have been several points like this where you'll do anything except admit what's completely obvious. It took us an hour for you to admit that a cop doing cocaine 3 times a week is a problem for everyone. The cop himself and the people he enforces the law on. It's a problem when professors do it. It's a problem with anyone with responsibility does it. And from my perspective, I believe in the equality of all mankind. So it's a problem when anyone does it because I don't believe in 2 separate classes of society, an elite for whom ethics matter and an underclass for whom ethics and laws don't matter. I regard us as... Okay, but, and now, the very simple question, is this harm?
You do not think that you should have the right to make the decision for your own life about how you're going to conduct yourself. You feel that it's right to give that authority to the government, to someone else, let them decide, because if you might harm yourself, you shouldn't be allowed to do it. And that goes back to the example of... Great question.
Let me answer your question. Let me answer your question. So you know the answer to my question, but let me answer your question with an example out of my first year economics textbook. Mm-hmm. If it's your decision, why does the government prevent you from selling yourself into slavery? Why? You may not think it does any harm. And yet, yes, we believe in having laws that are both for your benefit and for the social unit's benefit that prevents you from selling yourself into slavery, even if you feel you have a good deal. Even if you feel, you know what, this is okay. I'm going to get a lump sum. Okay. I'm going to give it to my ex-wife.
People do that all the time.
So your question is, do I believe? I'm sorry. It's a textbook example.
Okay,
sorry.
And it's a textbook example.
But you're asking me, do I believe that laws should prevent people from making the decisions themselves to give themselves brain damage? My answer is yes. I believe in environmental regulation against harmful chemicals in the workplace, in food labeling and making sure there isn't poison, things that cause health problems or brain damage in your food. I believe it in the workplace. I believe in it on industrial sites, and I believe in it with recreational drugs completely consistently. That's the same kind of harm. And it's completely consistent with slavery. The argument, but it's my personal choice. It's not going to impact anyone other than me. Guess what? I believe that the government has the right to eradicate slavery, which includes taking away the personal private choice of slave owners and slave sellers and people who might voluntarily choose to become slaves if you had a truly free market.
I'm sorry, but you don't really
I don't really believe what?
Because unlike a lot of people here on YouTube, You probably think that people have the right to take out mortgages. You think that they probably have the right to.
So this is another argument from false equivalency. This is another. Okay. You act okay. So again, before I've had to ask for an hour, and you've never admitted. Do you really believe there's no difference between drinking alcohol and using cocaine or huffing glue? And you never want to answer honestly that of course there's a difference. But now I can ask you: do you really believe there is no difference between slavery and a mortgage? Do you really believe that?
There is a difference.
So why make a totally insincere argument? You've just claimed that I don't really believe what I'm arguing. Of course I believe it. Of course I'm against slavery, and I don't regard it as equivalent to mortgages. Of course there's a difference. You probably have a mortgage right now. I don't know, but probably you do.
But again, with slavery, there's a whole lot of baggage there. I mean, maybe that was in your first year economics textbook. It was not in mine. But I don't think... There's
a lot of baggage? What does the baggage have to do with it? Who cares about the baggage?
You misheard me. I didn't say baggage.
Oh, I thought you said there's a lot of baggage there with slavery. That's what I thought you said.
Just the... I mean, obviously, it's slavery. Like, bad.
Yeah,
anyway.
Right? What do you mean baggage? What baggage? Sorry. It is what it is. It's slavery. I mean, ancient Egypt, they built the pyramids, but I'm against slavery. What can I tell you?
But you're saying that you don't have the right to decide for yourself what you're going to put in your body. That's what you're saying.
I believe that right now, if people want to use cocaine legally, they do have the right to buy an airplane ticket to Colombia. I think, in a sense, I mean, you do have that right, and we don't, and that's that. If you want to use other drugs, well, I think actually including cocaine, you can go to Amsterdam. Amsterdam, it's not legal, but it's tolerated. They're kind of in a gray area on drugs like cocaine and heroin. I think you do have that right. But on the other hand, I don't play this game that you play of pretending that somehow that the authority of a democratic government stops when we're talking about drugs that go into people's noses or veins or however they take them. No, I believe the government we talked about labeling on food. I'm really happy that the government forces companies to honestly admit whether or not bread contains L-cysteine, whether or not bread contains pork fat or a bunch of other things. That's government regulation. It's forcing it. And there isn't even a health problem with that. It's just because I'm a vegan and I don't want this stuff in my diet. I'm so happy with them. I'm so happy we have government regulation that makes food and soap and medicine safer. And cocaine causes brain damage. It causes other personal damage to your life and personal danger and personal harm. And on a social unit, it causes other kinds of problems. This is true. Sure. And I have absolutely no hesitation in saying to you, in the same way I believe that we can make slavery illegal and use force, ultimately the police or the army has to get involved with preventing slavery from existing and use force to abolish slavery or to abolish, as much as Japan has abolished, the use of cocaine and heroin. Sure, I have no hesitation at all.
Okay, the Japan example drives me crazy because you have one country, just because there are other countries with the same kind of drug laws, so you can't say, Japan managed to get rid of drug use, and yet these other countries that have similar laws, they haven't, so I'm not sure. You're just saying, be like Japan. Obviously, there's a whole lot of cultural context, everything else that goes there. It's an incredibly ridiculous argument to say, be like Japan, because we can't all be like Japan. If Colombia were today to enact the exact same policies that are in Japan, it would not have the exact same results. But going back to the main argument, the one we're going back to, you have the right to decide what you do to yourself, what you do to your body, as long as you're not hurting anyone else.
But that's not reality. I mean, you don't.
No, it is not reality. But if there was a law...
That's what you wish reality was. Right.
No, but I do think that it's a fundamental human right, and if we did have a law about it, voting on legalization or something like that, I would. Because I do think that it's a fundamental human right, even though I may not agree with it. I may think that it is harming your body. I may think that it's hurting your brain cells, obviously. Okay. Like you said, I've never done any of these things. But
why is cocaine a fundamental human right? That's what you've just argued.
I'm being able to do with your own body when it comes to the drugs that you choose to take, whether it's an antidepressant, Lipitor, cocaine. That's your choice. If you're an informed adult, you need to be able to make those decisions, and I think that it's wrong for the state to use force.
Why can't I sell bread with battery acid in it? Why can't people use
else, you're creating a harm to them.
So I can eat bread with battery acid.
Yes,
there's no okay.
I mean, Milton Friedman would probably agree. If you want to make bread with battery acid.
You have attributed an argument to me that I don't have. It's understandable that you did, but you've said Colombia can't do what Japan did. I agree with that, of course. My argument doesn't rely on the idea that Colombia or Los Angeles can achieve what Tokyo achieved. Definitely not in the next 20 years, but you could argue never. I was just living on the border between
Yunnan. But your whole argument that it's
but listen, your argument is based on a universal absolute. Your argument is based on the idea that cocaine should be a human right. You've just stated that in almost exactly those terms. Mine isn't. Mine is based on, you've heard this on my channel before, doing the best you can, right? As saying, hey, drug addiction is a problem. What can we do about it? And the answer is going to be different. I was living in Laos and Cambodia. The Cambodian government doesn't have the same resources the Japanese government has, just in terms of providing people with rehab facilities.
I feel like this is going on way too long, Axel, but yes, I as a person, I want to do the best I can. But as a society, I don't think we have the right to dictate to people what the best they can do is. So I think that's just the end of the argument. I disagree with you.
Okay, I agree. Well, I actually agree with you. You said that we can't dictate to people what the best they can do is. But precisely what we dictate are the minimum standards they have to meet. That if you want to be a police officer, you can't use any cocaine. If you want to be an airline pilot, what you can and can't do, whether it's cocaine or maybe even cough medicine. There are probably some cough medicines that are not safe for an airline pilot to take. I think exactly what legislation is about is creating minimum standards for people to live up to.
And you think those communitarian standards should be applied to everyone? I do not. Again, that's where we fundamentally disagree. You think that those rules should be applied to everyone? I do not.
Well, I see it. That's interesting you put it that way, because I see it exactly the opposite. I think your argument is the same standard should be applied to everyone, because your argument is that cocaine should be a human right for everyone. And that's exactly what I disagree with. So that is one standard applied to everyone, whether in Colombia...
There's always consequences for the things you decide to do. If you decide to put cocaine in you, even if it's legal, you may not get a job as a police officer. I'm not against having consequences.
It may lead to, as you know, it may lead to addiction and what have you. Or it may lead to you becoming a prostitute or what have you. It may lead to you living a much worse life, which there's a lot of literature proving.
You have to pay the price for the choices that you make in life. And I know we both agree on that. So, yeah.
Well, no, I don't. I think my vision is much more compassionate than yours, because yours is like Milton Friedman, which is just let people kill themselves, let the free market sort it out. And I don't think that's true. I think there are people who can intervene and save lives and improve people's lives and help them when they're addicts, which includes...
I fully endorse people doing that. I think people should help people who are addicts. I think we should all work as a society.
You can't do that if it's a human right to use cocaine.
Yes,
you don't have the right.
You can still help people. You can help people when they want help.
You don't have the right to arrest them. That is precisely what you...
That is the kind of help that I do not think is help. I don't think that's compassion, Eichel.
Right. No, but you see, I genuinely do. I hope that if my own daughter becomes addicted to drugs, like cocaine and heroin, that she can be arrested, i.e. stopped. Of course, I'd prefer if she goes into a nice rehab facility rather than a horrible prison. But arrest and coercion, i.e. it being a mandatory drug rehab, I hope that would happen to help my own daughter. I hope that would help to happen your own daughter. But yes, arrest is fundamental. And, drug addicts, especially when they're high, you say, they get help when they want help. Well, that could be too late, or it could be never. They can waste their lives away and die. So my view is more compassionate. It is more based on intervention. And intervention involves arrest.
I don't mind saying that you're more compassionate than me, Eisel. That's I'm freely willing to admit that. And that vision sounds more compassionate. Right. I think that it is more important. I think that it is more important to people to have the right to do as they see fit. I think that's more important. They will have to pay the consequences. In my world, they would pay the consequences. And obviously, I'm speaking in utopian terms. Your vision is what we currently have. I just believe that it is more important to give people the right to do that. And I think that's just... It's just a difference of opinion. It's obviously a fundamental different way of viewing the world.
Well, it's true, but, I think and this is why you contradict yourself when parents are mentioned. We don't really bear the consequence of our action. This is an issue with veganism, too. If someone buys beef, they don't really bear the consequences ecologically, for example, of meat production. There's no way in which they bear those consequences. This is one of the reasons why vegans want people to stop eating meat. You can buy beef, and you don't have to swim in the river that's being polluted by meat production. It's an externality, right? You can make the decision for yourself to become a drug addict, and you don't bear the consequences of your own children being neglected or raised poorly because you're or just a moderate drug user. Again, for me, it's not just being a drug addict. You can use cocaine 3 times a week. You don't actually deal with really most of the consequences. created for other people, even if you're not in a really high pressure job like being a police officer or a university professor. There are consequences for everyone, yourself included, that you'll never shoulder the responsibility for. How can you?
There's a lot of things that we can't. But Eisel, there's so many
you're
things.
correct.
Every day people behave badly.
That's an appeal to futility.
Jerks, and
that's an
appeal.
That's an appeal to futility, which is a fallacy. But there's a difference we can make, and it is the difference between Japan.
But you said,
Canada.
You've already admitted yourself, it's not the difference between Japan, because like you said, even if we make those choices, we will not get Japan. Japan is Japan. So your appeal is to Japan, but you've admitted
you don't like the
you won't get Japan.
No, I have many other examples in terms of for different countries, different things are possible. Mm-hmm. Laos is a very, very poor country, so their methods of drug enforcement are different.
Let's just take your example. In Colombia, I think that they obviously should allow people to, they should legalize the sale of drugs, because it's going to allow everyone to be safer in terms of consumption and everything like that. That's my position, you know that.
Right.
But if they were to go right now, like if we took your vision and we took it to Colombia and we said, you know what, we're going to have harsh penalties. We are going to make sure that this is illegal. We will punish it.
I don't think I've ever mentioned harsh penalties once, but go on. I don't think I have. Go on.
Maybe we'll all hold hands and sing Kumbaya at the coffee.
No. I've mentioned arrest.
But do you think it's going to be a much better society with people being arrested all the time? What are you going to even do with all these incarcerated people? Are we going to end up with
great question?
A million people in jail?
Great question. Yeah. And this is how this discussion began at the very beginning. I have a positive example of exactly that, which is Yunnan province, China, which is right on the border of a long-time civil war, growing opium and selling opium. They also produce methamphetamines and other synthetic drugs like ecstasy. So Yunnan is right on a border which is full of hard drug trafficking, also gun smuggling, and a number of other crimes like that. And they have an astoundingly high quality of law and order and quality of life for people. And yes, it is based on thousands and thousands of people being put in prison. That's not the whole solution. But that is an example of a poor country, not as poor as Laos, not as poor as Cambodia, but poor, and they are using very serious enforcement, which includes collecting everyone's emails in the whole country, everyone's text messages, and arresting people. And people who are just addicts, they do put into rehab. They don't have death penalty for users. Yeah. They do have death penalty for smugglers, people who smuggle it across the border. That is part of it. And Yunnan is a very successful example. And, again, maybe a couple dozen people are killed a year due to that policy. I don't know in terms of that. I completely accept that has some body count. And I'm not saying it's great. It would be great if we can reduce it. I'd like that body count to be as close to zero as possible. But, like all things, zero is almost never attainable. Your policy, so you just asked me, which is a great question. You said, what would happen in Cambodia if my proposal were Cambodia? I could ask you, what would happen in Yunnan if your proposal was applied? And you know that the number of drug users in Yunnan would increase. And we know this factually because the demand is there and it's being suppressed, it's being stopped. And the number of drug users would increase, and there would be tremendous social impacts, both for Yunnan and for that civil war. In many ways, Yunnan could descend into the kind of horrible situation Colombia was in the 1980s if your policies were applied in Yunnan.
Yeah. And you're arguing essentially that I can't say harm, because harm is my thing, it's not really yours, but you are saying that would be worse. That would be much worse, like having more drug addicts in Yunnan if my policy led, let's say it was a 5% increase in drug use in Yunnan. There's a 5% increase in drug use in Yunnan, but people are free to surf the internet as they like, to criticize.
But that's a completely separate issue. I'm sorry.
No, but
you can't possibly claim that freedom of speech is salient. That's why Japan I'm using more often than China.
Mine is based on being able to do with your
cocaine
life.
is not freedom of speech.
Trying to say that those, but
freedom of speech is a human right. Cocaine is not. That's my position. You believe both are human rights. You believe cocaine is a human right.
If you're going to just go with legalization, though, suddenly you have thousands of people who are in prison today who are back on the streets. To
that
you,
is
that's
true.
a crime. To me, that's human rights in action. That is, and if it's a 5% increase in drug use,
right,
I'm willing to accept that, because as heartless and uncompassionate as that may be, I would rather have those people with their civil liberties being able to make decisions than have them in prison against their will.
Right.
For the crime of putting something into their bodies that you don't like.
Right. You say that I think this is absolutely the last thing I have to say on this topic. But the other thing about speed limits. So I've never driven a car once in my whole life. I made that choice. Yeah. But if you choose to own a car, you choose to give up some of your civil liberties. There's all these rules of the road, and again, not everyone can have a driver's license. Maybe your eyesight isn't good enough, whatever it is, right? So it's actually limited, and it's unequal and prejudicial and what have you. We're not all equal as soon as you start driving a car.
Like my example of the legalization of drugs and the cop. Right. The cop can't do drugs, but maybe everybody else can.
If you enter into this kind of arrangement, if you accept a rules-based system, there are different colleges in the United States. Some colleges will give you stringent drug tests and force you to learn how to swim. It's really weird to me, forcing you to take swimming tests. And they'll have you live up to this. And some people are so eager to say, yeah, this is the college I want to sign up to. And some colleges are incredibly lax and permissive, and everyone is using drugs on campus. Everyone's using marijuana at least, and other drugs openly. And some people want to go to that college campus. But don't you think there's a sense of fair play that people understand what's right and wrong? They understand they have a sense of social responsibility. And they understand that they're letting people down by using cocaine. They're letting down their parents. They're letting down their kids. They're letting down themselves, maybe, or an expectation of what they could accomplish. And that, in fact, there is something wrong. Is it such a small percentage of people who feel, just in the same way, if I'm going to drive a car, I have to make some effort to be a good driver. You can think of it as an obligation to society if you want to, or you can think about it in other ways. But just, hey, this is a rules-based system. If I'm going to play this game, if I'm going to play this sport even, the sport has a set of rules within itself that's different from universal, human rights or something. It's just for this context. I don't see this as a simple situation of an oppressive government forcing people to not use cocaine. I think there is a sense of a game we play as society where we do take on responsibilities and say, hey, I'm a university professor, or I'm a police officer, or I'm me. I work on a construction site. But you know what? I understand this is part of my responsibility, is to not use cocaine. And I understand that using it is a crime.
Yeah, and I think the only difference between your example and mine is the crime aspect. I think that if we look at our society, I don't know many societies that totally all individuals praise drug use. I think as individuals, most of us, fortunately, tend to consider that as letting people down. We tend to consider drug use as letting people down. And as a society, because a democracy is made up of individuals, those individuals make up a society that believes that drug use is sad and it's letting people down.
Right.
I just think instead of making it a crime, we continue to say that it's wrong and to help people with it when they have that problem. We treat it as anything else instead of treating it as if it's a crime. We treat it as an illness. We treat even the use of your cocaine that you enjoy that you say is so enjoyable, that we treat that as a sad thing, and we treat it even something that makes people happy. That we can treat that as something that is concerning. We can discuss it for what it is without making it a crime.
In high schools all across America and all across Canada, in my high school, the kids who did drugs, do you think they're the cool kids or they're the uncool kids?
It depends on where you are, I would say.
In my high school, in the school I went to, in the school you went to.
They were not the cool kids where I went to.
Really?
Yeah, really.
Okay.
Very much not the cool kids. But I think it's because
so
I grew up...
they didn't get... okay, sorry, I'm surprised. Go on, yeah.
Definitely not. But that's because... on the one hand, I attended private school in high school.
It's a strange school.
But then I also grew up in an area where methamphetamine use and abuse was the norm.
It was epidemic. Yeah.
And I knew many, many people. And so, of course, it's the situation. And, of course, same deal for my husband, where he grew up in Colombia. But I grew up in the heart of meth country. And the kids, you felt so bad for them. They got teased mercilessly. They were always afraid to tell you anything about their lives. They would hide. They'd refuse to go to birthday parties. They were extremely unpopular, and even into high school, So my experience is different. So I can't.
Well, no, but that's okay. But that's a great contrast. But you must be able to appreciate the contrast between that situation and a situation where in high school, what's normalized is the guy with drugs is cool. The guy with drugs gets laid. Women have sex with him in order to have access to cocaine.
Yeah.
In which the cool kids in the high school and the powerful people in society are people using using drugs, hard drugs like cocaine and heroin.
Mm-hmm. I'm not, and I think like the argument I was making earlier, I don't think that should be cool. I don't think I don't think most people think it should be cool.
This is why I think you agree with me more than you think you do. Because if you describe...
Oh, yeah, we probably do agree more than we disagree.
But if you describe the objective you want, I think you want everything about Japanese society without the enforcement, without the legal coercion element. I think you want to live in a society with low levels of drug use and where the cool kid in high school, and also, but just include, because there are elements of power, not just being sexy or being cool. Again, in Laos, the people who had the drugs were also the people who had the guns. I mean, that ultimately is an issue of social power. They were the people who made decisions like a mayor locally, like a village chieftain or what have you. That's also a problem, is drugs being involved with power, not just sex and prestige and coolness. I think you want the same things I want. You don't want your daughter to go to a school where the cool kids are the ones who use drugs. I mean, again, and you in general don't want to be in a society where everyone's daughter is going to school with that. But that is the society we're in. I think that's very much the crossroads we're at. And my own, my own brothers, my own family, I've known so many people, impacted by this. I knew drug dealers in high school. Some of my friends were drug dealers, and of course I knew drug users. And, for me, at that age, in high school age, the only reason to be involved with drugs was sex. Yeah. If you were drugs and alcohol, or drugs including alcohol.
I totally agree with you about all that. Obviously, I would love to live in the kind of society you're talking about without the criminalization element. And I have to point out, one of my friends, who's from Holland, she said that one of the interesting things in her experience, growing up in that environment, was that drug use was not cool. Right. It was something that loser tourists went and did at coffee shops. Right. It was lame, and it was loserly, and the people who did it ended up being losers. It was not something that she ever aspired to. It wasn't that having it around. In fact, the legalization aspect, in her opinion, did make it less attractive. So I think maybe what we're narrowing down on is the idea that the social norms are more powerful.
Of course.
The legalization aspect.
Of course.
And it's not really a problem of criminalization. It's a problem of our attitudes and our responsibilities.
Well, I would say that you can say the same about speeding, driving too fast. Probably the cultural, because there can't be a cop on every corner. It can't just be enforcement. It has to be the attitude towards driving. The attitude, it's going to be more powerful. So I think that is true. However, I would not say the effect of enforcement is zero. Neither of us would say it's zero. This is kind of, but every society I studied as a scholar of Theravada Buddhism, which it was for more than 10 years. So Theravada Buddhism, really briefly, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, a few other little bits and pieces of Yunnan. All of those societies had access to opium from the dawn of civilization or earliest records. It's been there for thousands of years. It was never hard to make. Europe did too, incidentally. It's much overlooked that we have, really like caveman records with opium around. And yet, the effect of Theravada Buddhism on the culture, a culture that valorizes what I would call hypervigilance, where the idea, it's not about being cool, it's not about being realized, it's about being very alert and sharp, to be manly and to be virile in a Theravada Buddhist culture is to be really kind of on point, which can be a drag living in those cultures. I'm just saying, most people don't find that aspect of Sri Lankan culture very agreeable, but they'd probably prefer to be in a culture that's more laid back. But just the influence of that, I remember reading, we have no historical records from the pre-modern period of opium being a problem, even though the opium poppy grew like a weed and was used definitely as medicine for things like surgery or a broken arm, broken leg. But that was something sick people used. Oh, and the elderly used it when they had, back pain and stuff like that. Elderly people used it for various components of that. You don't want to be like a sick old man smoking opium. So just stigma on the one hand and, those kinds of powerful cultural perceptions, what it is to be manly and vibrant. That can, and it apparently worked for a couple centuries. I don't know how long, but those things they can be very powerful. And as I say, so there is actually a lot of common ground between our views on that theater, because actually the objective for the kind of society we want is the same, but what kind of body count of what type we're willing to tolerate is different.
And maybe if I continue with that example, I mean, if you look at use of cannabis throughout world history,
Right.
was a thing especially for people who are ill or anything like that,
Right.
for a very long time without
Right.
causing great harm.
Right.
Same with
in Yunnan, right? In Yunnan, marijuana was used as a flu remedy, but that was
Yeah.
it, and it was thus despised if you didn't have the flu or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
for a couple other traditions.
And same with coca in Colombia. I mean, it was just something you used mostly for altitude sickness and things like
Right.
that. And very powerful drugs like ayahuasca and things like that.
Right.
They kept limited to specific ceremonies and things like that. Peyote, things that were pretty extreme, but kept
Right.
culture. And I think what we're both saying here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one thing that we're both saying is that the power of culture
Yes.
is stronger than criminalization.
Mm-hmm.
That culture can be a stronger influence than criminalization. And maybe my one suggestion here, from my perspective, would simply be that increasing enforcement, like you hear people like I think his name is it Peter Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens' brother, always says that if you just punished people enough, they would not do drugs.
Right. So I don't believe that. I mean, I'm not a naive.
I know you
know,
don't.
I'm not a naive
and
endorser of
that's
that.
why I'm saying maybe, just
Right.
maybe, if we work on the culture part and ignore the legalization part. I mean, I may think that it would be nice for it to be legal. You think it would be nice for it to be illegal. We both have,
Correct.
you know.
Yeah.
We're both speaking hypothetically, to be perfectly honest. The only drug that I care
It's pretty
about
close to reality.
legalization
But anyway.
is cannabis, and that's going to be legalized, here in July. So the only drug that I really would genuinely advocate for publicly and ever have, frankly, even with the cocaine.
This is going on YouTube. This is pretty public. But anyway.
I have publicly advocated for cannabis legalization forever.
Right.
Again, something that I have never personally done thus far myself because
Right.
it's illegal, but I've always advocated for it because I think that it would help alleviate some issues with crime and stuff like that. But maybe the one thing that we can agree about here is just that whether you win or I do,
Right.
culture may play a bigger role
Sure.
because we've seen the laws in the U.S. Lots of laws against drugs there, lots of people in prison. And it hasn't had the same effect, even as Yunnan. Because if you look at the number of people in prison,
I agree
there's
completely.
Actually, I think
no, but there are failures. There are failures, and there are
When you look at
the
the
failures
number
are
of
very.
people in prison.
But Chicago was a failure. Los
Yeah.
Angeles. There are many failures. Absolutely.
That's great.
Yeah. No, of course.
So I'm very happy
No.
that I stayed with this conversation.
Yeah. No. I think it's very simple. But I think all of Mexico is a failure in that way also. I mean, maybe not Vermont. Maybe in I don't know shit about Vermont. But I say maybe in Vermont things are okay.
Yeah.
But no, most of those are really examples of profound failure. And I think we have to learn from examining the failures. And I think we can also learn from examining success like Japan. And I say there are many elements there, culture and otherwise. And some of them, maybe a wealthy country like Canada can learn from and adapt to the Canadian context.
Yeah.
And maybe for a country like Laos, maybe the best thing they can do is to legalize it temporarily. I sympathize with the decision made by the Colombian government, which was basically to drag their feet and allow cocaine to be legalized. Because I can imagine they get to a point where they say, look, we've shot so many people and we don't want to shoot people anymore, and let's try something new because we know the old way wasn't working, and we don't have a budget to imitate Japan.
And I think that's
so let's
really
try
critical.
legalization. I completely sympathize with what goes into that decision, and maybe you can even say having enforcement is a luxury that some countries can't afford, and there's a real argument as to what is best for Colombia and what is best for Mexico and what is best for Yunnan and Japan and so on. I'm very open to that kind of pragmatic contradiction. On the level of one-to-one reality, we'll wrap it up. I mean, don't worry. I've almost nothing more to say. But, I normally do not base my arguments on compassion. You've probably noticed this. Like within veganism, I almost never say to you, look at this cow. How can you fail to feel? It's kind of an easy card to play. There are all kinds of reasons why I don't bother to do that. But, compassion is still an issue in our ethics and what have you. You kind of said laughingly, like, oh, do you think arresting people is compassionate? I've known drug addicts who've talked about it. This, I think, does come from Socrates. One of the most fundamental ideas of Socrates is you can talk to people and they think they're happy, but they're not. You can debate with them what is true happiness. This is worth debating. People can think they're happy as drug addicts and be arrested and have 5 days in a prison cell and then 2 months in a rehab facility, and they look back and say, wow, that was just having the opportunity to get clean. I'm so glad I got arrested. how many times has that happened? I've read so many interviews where this kind of thing is related. So no, I mean, I know, in a very different context, you're kind of scoffing at the idea that arresting people is compassionate. I don't find the attitude of someone like Milton Friedman of saying just let them kill themselves, in contrast to walking down the street. And again, down the street is prejudicial because, as you say, it's mostly poor people on the street. Yeah. Let's say my own brother. I have brothers who are at various levels of socioeconomic status, but none of them are living on the street. But, my own brother, who's university educated, I can call him Richard. It's a fake name. So my brother Richard, I think it would have been a wonderful thing if he'd gotten arrested and even done hard time for his past drug use. I really do. I think it would have been good for him, and it would have been good for Canadian society. And, that maybe that sounds like an awful thing to say. But as I say, it's not out of glorifying it. Yeah. But to me, the question of being indifferent to someone being a drug addict, whether it's a stranger on the street, a literal homeless person, or your brother, or someone who's a wealthy executive or a rock star, and saying, look, the word arrest means stop. The power of arrest is here so we can stop you. You get clean, and, you may not have a choice but going to rehab.
But I guess I would close by saying that I think neither one of us wants to walk by that person. Neither one of us thinks that that's the right thing to do.
Sure.
I think that it really does have less to do with whether we put that person in prison or whether we put them in rehab. The reason that I have come to this position that I have, that legalization is preferable, is because when you look at rehabilitation for addicts, especially addicts, like the people who do become the addicts, the people who get the brain damage, the people who ruin their lives, the number of them that are rehabilitated is so incredibly low. Yep. And you look at, I think about my mom's friend. Her son is my age. We were friends growing up. His life is totally destroyed. He's been in rehab many times. He's been in prison many, many times. Yeah. And neither one has done any good for him. And you talk about this a lot. There are some issues that are just, I wish we had the science. I think someday we will, to be able to solve those issues. But we don't have the science to solve those issues right now. We're in this place where we don't know what to do. And for him, I just think, for someone like that it's going to be a very sad end no matter what. And when you look at the stats from Alcoholics Anonymous and things like that, you see how often people relapse when they have that severe addiction. I would rather see him taking the drugs that he needs in a supervised situation. Like I've seen what they do in Switzerland. His parents would sleep better at night. When you talk about a parent, like I've seen how his mom and dad have both suffered and the kind of impact that it's had on their lives. I don't think that criminalization has helped him in any way or helped them as parents. And I think you're so right about the cultural issues and how strong those are. And I very much agree with you. And I'm very pleased to see the people who come at this from different perspectives. I think you, again, on believing more in the legislation as an answer, me believing maybe more in freedom as the answer. We can both agree that there need to be serious cultural changes in order to make anything like that work.
Well, I think this is a major, major struggle for our generation. And, I think it is really possible you and I will both run for alderman or run for mayor in the future. And this video could come back to, well, it can be quoted. In my whole life, I used cocaine once because I read that book. If you guys didn't guess, when I said it's infinitely more than zero, the number was 1.
I think Barack Obama did as well, and he mentioned it in his book. So
Okay.
He talks about it in his book, so there you go. And that was before he was elected president.
Right. So. All this can be quoted to discredit us. But, I do think it's ironic
Mine
that...
is going to be... Cops can do coke
3 times a week. 3 times a week is okay, right? 4 or 5, we gotta draw the line somewhere, right? Yeah.
I'm way more amenable to changing my mind on all the issues.
But it is interesting. Like veganism, I think it is true that you and I both are engaged with this issue because we are interested in making the world a better place. Whether you think about that in terms of compassion or harm reduction or, however you want to put it. And, I think, I hope I still know you 20 years from now. I really do.
Oh, yeah.
But no, this is one of those issues. 20 years from now, Iraq could be a peaceful democracy. 20 years from now, the world could change in many ways. What will Afghanistan be like 20 years from now? I'm not recklessly optimistic. What will Cambodia? Cambodia could be a, paradise on earth.
Well, maybe we'll be able to have more of an accurate discussion of the policy consequences of drug legalization.
Well, if there's one thing for sure, 20 years from now, this problem will not go away. And to use the locus that started the conversation, I don't think either one of us believes that specifically Vancouver, Canada, neither of us thinks that issue will go away. So I think it is a major ethical, political, and legal issue for our times. And Canada, Colombia, and all the rest of the world is going to argue with it. Is going to wrestle with it. And I was going to say, I do think you're correct in asking the questions about freedom. I really do. But just as I don't believe in the freedom that you can poo anywhere. Sewage treatment also involves coercion of saying, no, we're going to force you to participate in our government conspiracy to put sewage into pipes, and you can't put it here. It's very specific. What isn't allowed. There are all kinds of things where I say, oh, yeah. Over here we have freedom, and then we draw a line, and over here there's no freedom. And, this is a case where you and I draw the line at a different point in the map. Okay. Yeah. Great talking to you, Mod. Great way to spend 3 hours. And,
I think the first 2 hours were pretty much completely useless, but I'm really glad.
We'll see. Well, okay, I'll tell you what, though. It may not be that so many people listen to the full 3 hours, but a lot of people do listen to the podcast. I'm going to give a link below this video so people can get it, download it just as a podcast, and listen to it while they do the dishes. You may have thought the first 2 hours were not useful to you, but I'm certain there will be some people in the audience for whom that's hashing out some issues they'd never thought of before from two very peculiar and very vegan perspectives that maybe the world has never seen before.